You first notice her on a night when the sirens rise earlier than expected, just past dusk, when most people are still finishing their evening chores. She moves quickly, not in panic, but in a rhythm shaped by repetition. One hand holds a lantern, the other supports her husband's elderly mother, guiding her down the stairwell that leads toward the bunker entrance. You follow at a distance with the others, caught in the same current of movement that sweeps through the building whenever the alarms begin. Even without speaking, it's clear she knows this routine well. Everyone does. Before you follow her story further, settle in. Let the night quiet around you, and if these calm histories help you drift or reflect, you can subscribe whenever the moment feels right. And let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. The air outside is sharp with cold, the sky already darkened by blackout curtains drawn across the city. People hurry through the courtyard in near silence, their footsteps echoing against the walls as they descend into the shelter. You see her again just ahead of you, adjusting her grip on the older woman's arm, steadying her through the rush of neighbors funneling toward the concrete doorway. Her movements are careful but practiced, her face composed in the way people become after months of knowing that fear must be managed, not displayed. Inside the bunker, the air is thick with damp coats and whispered instructions. You take a seat near the wall, and she settles 2 benches away, lowering the elderly woman gently before sitting beside her. She does not look around much. Her attention stays on the older woman, adjusting her scarf, brushing dust from her sleeve, offering quiet reassurance that the raid will pass as all the others have. You notice how her calm steadies those near her, even though no one acknowledges it aloud. The first distant thud rolls through the ground with a slow, heavy vibration. People shift slightly, but no one panics. She glances upwards, just once, before folding her hands in her lap. The elderly woman reaches for her arm, and she responds with a slight nod and a small, steadying smile. It's a private gesture, one meant for someone she loves, but its quiet resolve radiates outward. The sounds above grow louder, more defined. The dull boom of high-explosive bombs, the rattling windows, the faint trembling of dust drifting from the ceiling beams. Children cling to their mothers. Men sit stiffly, exhaling through their noses, avoiding one another's eyes. Yet she remains composed, even when the bench shudders under a closer strike. She places her hand over the older woman's, anchoring her through the vibration. There is tension in her jaw, but she does not let it surface. These nights have become the architecture of life, descending into the bunker, waiting, emerging, repairing, rationing, then descending again. She carries herself with a steadiness that suggests she has learned to live inside this endless cycle. Her husband is at the front, as are so many others, and she now carries the responsibilities of 2 households, her own and the emotional well-being of the woman beside her. Even without speaking to her, you recognize the weight she bears. It is written in the small efficiencies of her movements, in the quiet way she watches everything around her. As the bombing continues, the bunker settles into its familiar silences. Someone near the door whispers a prayer. A warden checks the passageway. A candle sputters and is shielded carefully. In the dim light, there is a subtle change in the room, the tightening shoulders during each deep concussion, the soft release of breath during the brief pauses. And you notice how she responds to all of it, not with outward fear, but with a slow, deliberate composure that becomes its own kind of refuge. Hours pass like this. The raids rise and fall in waves, each one carving another layer of fatigue into the faces around you. When the all-clear finally arrives, soft, distant, almost anticlimactic, people hesitate, listening for any final explosion before standing. She helps the older woman to her feet, checking first to ensure her legs are steady. As the crowd begins to move, the 2 of them enter the tunnel ahead of you. Even in the cramped corridor, She maintains a quiet gentleness, guiding the older woman with a patience that seems almost impossible after such a long night. The air is cold, carrying the smell of smoke and damp earth. She pauses at the courtyard entrance, adjusting the older woman's coat before continuing toward their building. Her lantern casts a faint glow on the walls, revealing cracks that were not there the previous evening. She notices them, but only briefly. The priority now is reaching home, assessing damage, and preparing for whatever the next day brings. You follow the same path, moving in parallel without crossing her steps. This is how you first come to recognize her, not through conversation, but through repeated presence. A steady figure in the same bunker, on the same streets, living through the same nights of uncertainty. You do not share words, only the silent familiarity of people who cross paths under falling bombs. In time, she becomes a point of quiet continuity. As the raids intensify, as shortages grow worse, as despair settles deeper into the city, you see her again and again, always composed, always steady, always carrying more than her share, and doing so without drawing attention. Through her, you begin to understand the life German women built beneath the ruptured skies, a life shaped by endurance, quiet courage, and the weight of ordinary moments stretched across extraordinary circumstances. The rhythm of descent. You see her again 2 nights later, moving through the courtyard the moment the first siren begins its long, rising call. She doesn't rush, not in the frantic way newcomers sometimes do, but she wastes no motion. Her husband's mother clings to her arm, and together they navigate the stairwell with a practiced coordination that speaks to countless repetitions of this exact journey. There is a flow of people behind them, carried by the same momentum that overtakes the building whenever the alarms cut through the evening air. The courtyard is dim beneath the blackout curtains, lit only by a few shielded lanterns held by residents guiding one another across uneven cobblestones. She adjusts her pace to match the older woman's slower steps. Even through the haze of urgency, there is a softness in the way she supports her, steady, calm, protective. You move a few paces behind, noticing how she tilts her head slightly whenever the engines in the distance shift pitch, listening for signs of how close the danger is. Inside the bunker, she guides the older woman to the same bench as before. Some shelters are chaotic, but this one has developed its own informal order. Families sit in familiar clusters. The elderly gather near the corners where the shaking feels less severe. Mothers with infants settle along the walls for support. She moves through this arrangement with ease, placing herself beside the older woman and offering a quiet greeting to the neighbors who recognize her. The air grows heavy quickly, coats dripping with melted snow, bodies pressed close, the mixture of candle smoke and concrete dust settling in the stillness. Her lantern flickers on the floor beside her, casting a muted glow over her face. She folds her hands in her lap, and for a moment, the shelter seems to inhale collectively, bracing for what's coming. The first explosions arrive slowly, distant, muffled, like a storm forming beyond the horizon. People exchange glances, assessing, calculating. The elderly woman beside her stiffens, and she responds by placing a steadying arm around her shoulders, murmuring reassurance. It doesn't matter. The older woman closes her eyes, breathes more evenly, and leans into the gentle pressure of that touch. As the bombing intensifies, dust begins to drift from the ceiling in soft, irregular pulses. A child across the room clutches a toy tightly, eyes fixed on the lanterns. A man near the entrance shifts his weight anxiously, hands pressed against his knees. Through all this, she remains composed, her attention moving between the older woman and the room itself, watching, listening, adjusting her posture as though grounding herself physically against the vibrations. When the explosions grow louder, she lowers her head slightly, as though sheltering the older woman within her presence. When there's a lull, she reaches into her basket and retrieves a folded blanket, placing it gently across the older woman's lap. These gestures, quiet and unadorned, carry the steadiness of someone who has long accepted her role: protector, caretaker, and emotional anchor. The hours stretch on. The shelter holds its collective breath through each wave of destruction. From time to time, someone whispers a guess about which district is being hit. Others shake their heads, unwilling to speculate. She stays silent, her focus constant. In her stillness, there is a determination that draws your attention again and again. Not heroic, not dramatic, but deeply human. When the all-clear finally sounds, a subtle release passes through the room. People gather their belongings slowly, as though waking from a long, heavy sleep. She rises carefully, supporting the older woman once more. Outside, the courtyard is littered with fresh debris. The glow of distant fires illuminates the rooftops. She pauses just long enough to brush dust from the older woman's coat, then continues forward. The night has changed the city again, but she moves with the same quiet resolve as always, prepared to face whatever the darkness has left behind. Small rituals of safety. By the time you reach the street, she is already guiding the older woman toward their doorway, their lantern casting a thin line of light across the broken pavement. The raid has ended, but the atmosphere still holds the weight of what happened overhead. Smoke drifting along rooftops, the faint crackle of a distant fire, the silence that follows shock rather than peace. She pauses once to look upward, not out of curiosity but out of habit, confirming that the sky holds nothing more than the fading glow of searchlights sweeping across the clouds. Inside the stairwell, her footsteps slow. A loose tile, a fallen beam, scattered plaster. She anticipates each one, adjusting her movements to keep the older woman steady. This part of the night feels as routine as the descent into the bunker, but there is a carefulness to it, a structure of small rituals she performs every time they return home. At their doorway, she slips the key into the lock with deliberate calm, keeping her body angled just slightly in front of the older woman. You've seen this posture before in others who carry responsibility for someone more fragile. It isn't dramatic, but it's unmistakable. The quiet instinct to shield, to absorb the moment before allowing it to reach someone else. As the door opens, a thin layer of dust shifts across the floor. The room beyond is dim, illuminated by the lantern she brings inside. Even without speaking to her, you can tell she notices everything at once: the cracked ceiling, the fallen books, the broken vase near the window. She doesn't react outwardly. Instead, she guides the older woman to a chair that has remained upright, brushing debris from the seat before helping her settle. Only once the older woman is stable does she allow herself a moment to assess the damage. She moves through the room methodically, checking for drafts, testing the integrity of the window frame, lifting fragments of plaster to reveal what lies beneath. You observe her steadiness, the way she approaches each task with quiet efficiency. It isn't denial, it's discipline. This is how she keeps the night manageable. When she picks up a framed photograph that fell from a shelf, a young couple smiling on their wedding day, it catches the lantern light for a moment. She studies it, brushing dust from the glass, her expression unchanged but not indifferent. She places it gently on the table, angled so the older woman can see it when she looks up. It's a gesture that carries more comfort than words ever could. You begin to notice the rhythm of her movements: clean first, repair second, reorganize last. She sweeps the floor in slow, controlled strokes, gathering debris into a neat pile despite the exhaustion etched into the corners of her posture. She rehangs the blackout curtain, checks the hinges on the door, and straightens the chair that wobbled during the shaking. Everything she does contributes to the same purpose: to restore order, however temporary, before the next day begins. Across the hallway, another resident calls down to neighbors, checking whether anyone needs help. A child cries somewhere on the upper floor. The building is alive with the sounds of people taking stock of their homes. Yet she remains focused, creating a small sanctuary within the chaos. This is how she survives the war, through the discipline of small, deliberate acts that reaffirm control where so little of it exists. Before extinguishing the lantern, she kneels to check on the older woman, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders and offering a soft reassurance. The older woman reaches for her hand, and the younger woman holds it briefly, her expression softening in the low light. There is tenderness there, shaped not by ease but by endurance, an emotional familiarity forged in the rhythm of countless nights like this one. You retreat quietly to your own doorway, leaving her in the dim glow of her lantern's final flicker. As the light fades, the pattern of her nights has become the framework of survival for both women, a sequence of practiced gestures that protect, restore, and prepare them for whatever. Life between raids. Morning arrives with a pale, diluted light that slips through the blackout curtains, revealing a room still marked by the night's violence. She moves slowly, guiding the older woman with one arm while carrying a small basket of tools and rags in the other. Her expression is calm, but her eyes move with quick, searching awareness, taking in cracks along the walls, loose debris on the steps, and the subtle shifts in the building's structure. Outside, the street carries the aftermath in layers. Soot clings to the cobblestones. Windows across the block are shattered in jagged patterns. Smoke still rises in thin threads from a collapsed rooftop farther down the street. People gather in small clusters, whispering updates, comparing damage, and confirming which houses were hit worst. She listens but does not linger. Her priority is the elderly woman beside her, whose steps falter slightly on the uneven ground. She leads the older woman to a bench in the courtyard, one of the few still standing after weeks of raids. The bench has become a kind of morning ritual for many residents, a place to rest before the day's demands begin, to breathe, to orient themselves after the chaos of the night. She helps the older woman sit, smoothing her coat, then straightens to take in the street with a long, steady look. The day between raids always carries a strange duality. People work quickly, repairing what they can, knowing that the timeline until the next alarm is unpredictable. Yet there is also a kind of forced normalcy, children playing quietly along the edges of courtyards, men sweeping glass from entryways, women hanging damp clothing on improvised lines stretched between cracked walls. She moves through this landscape with purpose. You watch her begin the small repairs she can manage alone, resetting the crooked door frame, collecting fallen bricks into neat piles along the wall, dusting soot from window ledges. When the older woman calls her name, she returns immediately, kneeling to adjust a shawl slipping from her shoulders. Their exchange is brief but gentle. Even here, where the day's work demands concentration and speed, she never rushes her care. Later, in the ration line, you see her again. She stands a few places ahead, holding ration cards in one hand and the basket against her hip. Her posture is straight, her breathing even, qualities that contrast sharply with the tension humming in the line. People speak quietly, exchanging news about shortages and deliveries that may or may not arrive. She listens but contributes little. Her focus stays on the official behind the counter, and when her turn comes, she steps forward with a calm efficiency, collecting bread, potatoes, and a small tin of fat before stepping aside. She returns home. She stops at the courtyard pump to fill a bucket with water, testing the temperature with her fingertips before lifting it with both hands. The older woman waits at the doorway, holding the wall for balance. When she sees the younger woman approaching, her shoulders loosen slightly. The two move inside together, their silhouettes merging briefly against the dim interior before the door closes behind them. Inside their apartment, she resumes the quiet rituals of life between raids. She boils water to wash soot from the older woman's hands and face. She cleans the dishes that survived the night's shaking. She folds the rationed bread into a cloth to keep it from drying out. Every action is small, unremarkable on its own, but each one restores a fragment of normalcy. From a window, her voice can be heard through the thin walls, not loud, not strained, but steady. She speaks to the older woman with a tone that blends reassurance and practicality, narrating the tasks at hand in a way that keeps fear at bay. It is a form of grounding for both of them. By late afternoon, the neighborhood carries an uneasy calm. People return to their homes, shop doors close, and the city seems to prepare itself for whatever the night will bring. She finishes washing a final dish, extinguishes the stove, and checks the blackout curtains with deliberate care. The older woman sits beside her, hands folded in her lap, watching her movements with quiet trust. The hours between raids are not peaceful, but they are necessary. They allow the city to reset, however incompletely, and they give her just enough time to gather strength for the next alarm. As evening approaches, she stands at the window, lantern in hand, the faint glow outlining her profile. She looks out not with expectation, but with readiness. This is the rhythm of her life now: endurance measured in hours, steadiness held together by routine, and survival shaped by all the moments between the sirens. Holding together what the war tries to pull apart. The older woman sits near the window, far enough from the glass to be safe if it shatters, close enough to feel the faint breeze that slips through a crack in the frame. The younger woman kneels beside her, brushing dust from her shawl and straightening the cushion behind her back. These small gestures are constant, repeated dozens of times a day, forming an invisible thread of care that binds the two of them together. The room carries the signs of strain: patches of soot on the walls, a crack above the door frame, dishes drying on a towel because the cupboard where they once lived no longer has a door. Yet she moves through it as though the damage is simply another element of life, a variable she must work around like ration shortages or blackout restrictions. Her steadiness is not born from ease, but necessity. You watch from the stairwell as she begins preparing their evening meal. Ingredients are limited, but she works with deliberate calm, peeling potatoes with careful strokes, stirring a thin soup that simmers in a dented pot, adding small pinches of herbs saved from better days. She tastes the broth with the edge of a spoon, adjusts it slightly, then carries a bowl to the older woman. The routine is humble, but it holds the weight of continuity. In a world shaped by ruptures, she restores coherence one meal at a time. After they eat, she cleans their dishes in a shallow basin, her movements slow from fatigue but unbroken. The older woman watches her with a mixture of gratitude and worry. You've seen that expression before: older residents who understand how much is being carried on young shoulders. The young woman senses it too. She answers with a small, reassuring smile, the kind that says, "I can manage this. I have to." She clasps the older woman's hand as they take a brief walk, both moving carefully along the path cleared of broken glass earlier in the day. The courtyard, damaged and dim, becomes a temporary refuge. Neighbors lean out of windows, calling soft greetings. Children collect pieces of brick, arranging them into imagined walls and houses. The young woman watches them for a moment, her expression caught between longing for normalcy and acceptance of the life she must navigate. You notice how she adjusts her posture when the older woman stumbles, a subtle shift of weight, a tightening of her grip, a gentle murmur of reassurance. None of it draws attention. It is simply what she does: anticipate danger, soften impact, hold things together before they can break further. Inside again, she checks her emergency basket, making sure the documents are dry, the spare blanket is folded, the small tin of biscuits is still closed. She replaces the lantern oil, tests the wick, and lays the basket beside the door. The older woman watches her with tired eyes. For both of them, this ritual has become a form of emotional preparation, the quiet acknowledgement that the night may yet hold another descent into darkness. As the evening deepens, she sits beside the older woman and begins mending a tear in her shawl. The needle moves steadily through the fabric, each stitch small and precise. You've seen other women do the same, turning damaged items into usable ones, extending the life of garments that would be impossible to replace. But there's something in her expression as she works, a blend of concentration and calm acceptance, as though sewing were a form of meditation, a way of stitching herself back together while repairing the things the war keeps tearing open. Through the thin walls, voices of neighbors drift in and out, soft conversations, the clatter of someone repairing a loose board, a child's brief laughter quickly hushed. The building is worn but still alive, its residents bound together by shared endurance. And she is part of that quiet network, contributing to its steadiness without needing acknowledgement. When the lantern is finally dimmed and the room grows dark, she returns to the older woman, adjusting her blanket and whispering something you can't hear. The older woman relaxes slightly, her shoulders easing. The young woman settles beside her, not to sleep, but to listen, to the stillness, to the wind, to the distant hum that may or may not be the beginning of another night of sirens. You step back into your own room, understanding that what she holds together each day and night is far greater than the tasks themselves. She maintains not just the household, but the fragile emotional balance that keeps both of them moving forward. Her resilience is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is a series of quiet acts performed in the spaces between alarms, acts that shape survival long before anyone reaches the bunker. Shelter hierarchies and the weight of shared space. When the next raid arrives 3 nights later, you descend into the bunker with the same flowing crowd of neighbors, but now you notice the patterns more clearly, the unspoken rules that shape how people inhabit this underground world. She is already inside when you enter, guiding the older woman to the bench she always uses. It isn't assigned, but everyone treats it as hers. These informal territories have become essential in a place where privacy is impossible and comfort is scarce. Around you, people take their places with subtle deference to age, frailty, and habit. A family with 2 small children moves toward a corner where the shaking feels less severe. An elderly man positions himself near the wall he's leaned against since winter began. She keeps her bench not because it offers special protection, but because routine provides structure, something predictable in a night defined by chaos. The older woman sits slowly, gripping her hand until she's steady. The young woman doesn't let go immediately. She keeps her hand there a moment longer, as if transferring calm through touch. Only after the older woman exhales does she sit beside her, folding her coat neatly and placing it between them for warmth. Across the bunker, small tensions flicker like sparks. Someone mutters about the overcrowding. A mother shushes a child who cannot keep his feet still. A man complains under his breath that newcomers have taken the seats nearest the wall. These frictions are familiar. They surface every night, born not of ill will but of frayed nerves and exhaustion. People are polite until fear begins to stretch their patience thin. She navigates these moments without speaking. When a woman with a limp enters and finds no seat, she shifts slightly, tilting the older woman's knees so space opens up beside them. No words, just a gesture. The limping woman nods in gratitude and sits. These small negotiations maintain the fragile balance of the room. The warden closes the bunker door, and a hush spreads through the crowd. People know this sound well, the metallic finality that signals the beginning of waiting. Lanterns flicker. The damp air thickens. You see her take the older woman's hand again, holding it gently, as if reminding her of something familiar before the fear has a chance to rise. The first explosion arrives moments later, a distant concussion rolling down the tunnel. Heads lift, shoulders tense. Children shift closer to their mothers. The older woman flinches, and the young woman responds instantly, leaning slightly toward her, murmuring something soft, her presence becoming a shield without requiring distance from anyone else. Hierarchy in the bunker takes shape through these gestures, not through authority, but through stability. People look toward those who appear calm, even if that calm is only surface deep. People's eyes drift toward her during louder blasts, not in expectation, but in reassurance. If she remains steady, perhaps they can too. A new family enters late, bringing with them a wave of cold air and a sense of disruption. The father asks if there is room on a nearby bench, but receives only tight shakes of the head. Before tension can rise further, she lifts her lantern slightly, illuminating the space beside her. She shifts, guiding the older woman closer to her own side, making just enough room for the mother and child. Again, no dialogue, just an unspoken offering that diffuses what could have become conflict. People adjust subtly, and the room absorbs the newcomers. The family settles, breathing out as though they have been holding their lungs since the first siren. You realize then how quickly cohesion can fracture, and how easily one steady presence can hold it together. Above ground, the bombing intensifies. The bunker absorbs the sound in layers. First the distant hum, then the percussive thuds, then the sharper cracks of impact closer to the district. Dust falls in faint patterns. A lantern flickers. A child whimpers. But the people here do not panic. They simply tighten themselves inward, each relying on the familiar arrangement of bodies, benches, and silent agreements. You watch her throughout the vibrations, noting how she prepares for each one, tensing slightly before the next shockwave arrives, bracing the older woman with an arm, steadying her own breathing so quietly that it becomes part of the bunker's rhythm. She looks around occasionally, but only to assess, not to seek help. This is a role she has accepted, though no one assigned it to her. In this underground world, people like her shape the emotional landscape. Her composure creates a buffer, something that softens the atmosphere just enough for others to remain steady. The raid continues above, indifferent to the lives gathered below, but the bunker remains intact, held together by more than concrete. It is held together by the people inside it, their quiet negotiations, and the unspoken dependence on those who seem capable of withstanding a little more than the rest. And tonight, as on so many nights, she is one of those people. Tension, fatigue, and the fragile calm underground. As the raid stretches deeper into the night, the bunker shifts into the uneasy stillness that always follows the first wave of explosions. People settle into positions meant to conserve strength, backs straight, hands clasped, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. It is in these long stretches that the strain becomes visible. Fatigue softens postures, tempers edge closer to breaking, and even the familiar rituals of endurance begin to feel thin. You notice it in the way someone across the room rubs their temples, in the way a mother quietly counts breaths between her child's questions, in the way shoulders slump under the weight of another sleepless night. The air grows warmer, thicker, more crowded. A lantern flickers, and the shadow it casts makes the walls seem closer than they are. The young woman sits at the center of this quiet unraveling. Her expression remains composed, but the signs of exhaustion surface in small human ways. A slow blinking of her eyes, the way she rolls her shoulders back after each tremor, the deeper breath she draws when the older woman squeezes her hand too tightly. She doesn't hide her fatigue. She manages it, shaping it into something functional rather than letting it spill outward. When a muffled blast lands unexpectedly close, the older woman startles violently, letting out a sharp gasp. A few people glance over, their nerves already frayed enough that any sudden sound feels intrusive. But the young woman reacts instantly, leaning close and speaking softly, soothing, steady, a private lifeline threaded through the heavy air. Her voice is too quiet for you to hear, but the effect is unmistakable. The older woman's shoulders lower, her breathing slows, and the moment of tension passes before it can ripple across the room. Not everyone has the same steadiness. A man near the entrance mutters anxiously each time the bombers pass overhead, his leg bouncing rapidly. Someone shushes him. Someone else asks for quiet. The irritation builds, thin and brittle. Normally, such frictions would be ignored, but here, underground, every sound matters. Every gesture carries weight. She responds not by intervening. She never tries to correct others, but by becoming a point of calm within the rising tension. When another tremor rattles the benches, she shifts her lantern slightly, its warm glow expanding to cast softer light across her immediate corner of the bunker. The effect is subtle but grounding. People nearby seem to breathe more evenly in the steadier circle of light. A child begins to cry on the far side of the room, worn down by exhaustion rather than fear. His mother rocks him, whispering promises that dawn is coming, that bombs cannot last forever. The crying grates on some, but no one says anything. The bunker's emotional boundaries are stretched thin, yet somehow still holding. People endure by allowing each other these moments. The young woman closes her eyes briefly, not in sleep, but in a moment of inward gathering. When she opens them, her posture is straighter. She reaches for the older woman's hand, clasping it with a firmness that seems to anchor them both. Her endurance becomes a quiet influence, helping those around her maintain their composure simply by witnessing her own. The raid enters another wave, deeper and more intense. Dust shakes loose from overhead beams, drifting like ash. The bunker vibrates with the force of explosions landing somewhere too close to ignore. A few people flinch. Someone swears under their breath. But no one breaks. The fragile calm holds, stretched but intact. Through the haze, you observe the young woman's face in the lantern light. It is tired, yes. Strained, certainly. But steady. She absorbs the vibrations with a slight tightening of her shoulders, then releases them in a controlled breath. She keeps her gaze forward, not fixed on any single point but open, alert, grounded, aware. In her presence, the bunker feels less claustrophobic. Not safer, but more bearable. She does nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic. She simply endures well, and that endurance has a quiet gravity that influences everyone nearby. Hours pass this way, slow, tense, filled with faint tremors and the shifting weight of fatigue. The bombers eventually move on, the concussions becoming more distant, then fading entirely. A long silence settles in the bunker, and people look toward the door, waiting, hoping. The young woman straightens her coat. The older woman releases her hand only when the all-clear siren finally wavers through the night. Relief sweeps through the room in small, exhausted exhalations. The danger has passed, but the night has left its mark. Picking through the morning after. The all-clear has long faded by the time the bunker empties, but the night's thunder still lingers in the air, echoes trapped in the stones, the dust, the strained muscles of people climbing back toward the surface. When you step outside, she is a few paces ahead, guiding the older woman carefully through the doorway and into the courtyard. Dawn is just beginning to press against the horizon, a thin band of grey light revealing a world altered once again. The street is quieter than usual. Not still, never still, but suspended, as though everyone is waiting to see the extent of what the darkness has done. She pauses at the threshold, adjusting her grip on the older woman's arm as they take in the sight before them. The building across the street has lost part of its upper floor. Smoke rises in slow, reluctant threads. Piles of brick spill onto the roadway. Windows have been blown inward, scattering glass in wide, glittering arcs across the ground. A warden moves between the debris, marking unstable areas with chalk. A group of neighbors stands nearby, whispering the names of people who once lived in the damaged section. She guides the older woman forward with careful steps, avoiding jagged fragments, shifting loose stones with the edge of her shoe. You follow at a distance, noticing how she scans the rooftops first, checking for weakened chimneys or beams that might collapse without warning. Only after she is certain the path is safe does she continue. As she rounds the corner toward her own building, her pace slows. A section of the roof has shifted, leaving tiles scattered across the courtyard. A window on the upper floor hangs open, its frame crooked. Her expression remains composed, but you see the small tightening around her eyes, the moment of internal calculation as she imagines the work ahead, the repairs, the adjustments, the possibility of hidden damage. Inside the stairwell, the air smells of dust and lingering smoke. The walls carry new cracks, thin but widening toward the ceiling. She touches one lightly with her fingertips, assessing its depth, then guides the older woman up the steps with renewed care. Each footfall is deliberate. She pays attention to every creak of the wood, every shift in the plaster, listening for anything that might indicate structural weakness. When they reach their door, she opens it slowly, keeping her body slightly ahead of the older woman. The room inside is dim, but even in the low light, the new damage is visible. The table has been pushed against the wall by the shock wave. A cupboard door has torn loose from its hinge. A chair lies toppled beside a pile of fallen soot. She takes a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to steady herself, then begins the familiar ritual of restoration. She helps the older woman to her seat, brushing dust from the cushion, ensuring the chair is stable. Only then does she turn to the room. You watch her methodically gather the scattered items, the spoon that rolled beneath the table, the book whose pages are now streaked with gray, the cracked jar she examines briefly before deciding whether it can still be used. Her movements are slow, careful, and almost meditative. She sorts what can be repaired from what must be discarded, creating small piles that will guide her work through the morning. Neighbors move through the hallway, calling out to each other, checking whose homes are intact. A woman from the floor above stops at the doorway to ask if they need help. The young woman thanks her quietly but shakes her head. She knows her tasks. She has done this many times before. As she cleans, you notice the small details, the way she lifts each object with respect, as though acknowledging the life it belonged to before the war began, the way she keeps glancing toward the older woman to ensure she's comfortable, the way she restores order piece by piece, even when the room itself feels beyond reclaiming. These clearing rituals are more than practical necessity. They are emotional fortification. They allow her to reclaim the space from the night's violence, to assert that life continues, that the room is still theirs despite the damage. By mid-morning, the light strengthens. She pauses at the window, gently brushing shards of glass into a bowl. The breeze lifts the dust from the sill. For a moment, she closes her eyes, letting the air cool her face. When she opens them, her expression is steady again. The morning after a raid is always heavy, but she moves through it with the quiet courage of someone who has learned to carry fear without letting it dictate the shape of her day. The work of repairing what never fully heals. By late morning, the neighborhood has shifted into its familiar post-raid rhythm, a blend of quiet urgency and exhausted determination. People move through the streets with tools in hand, sweeping debris, propping up splintered doors, and checking on those who live alone. You see her emerge from the stairwell, supporting the older woman with one arm while carrying a small cloth bag with the other. Its contents clink softly: nails, a small hammer, a bit of string, items she has collected over months of learning to repair what the war continually tries to undo. She helps the older woman to her usual bench in the courtyard and settles her there with a shawl before beginning her tasks. Her steps are careful but purposeful as she walks the perimeter of the building, checking for new cracks and unstable sections of wall. You watch her bend to clear broken tiles, stacking them neatly to keep the walkway passable. Her movements are slow, deliberate, the exhaustion from the night showing in the slight heaviness of her shoulders, but she continues without hesitation. When she finds a loose shutter hanging at an angle, she stands on her toes to test its strength. The hinge gives slightly under her touch. She retrieves the hammer and taps the nail back into place with gentle, precise strokes, mindful of not startling the older woman nearby. These repairs won't last indefinitely. Everyone knows that, but they keep the building functioning for another day. And in times like these, another day matters. A neighbor approaches with a worried expression, pointing toward the roofline where several tiles have shifted dangerously close to the edge. The young woman listens quietly, nodding. She is not the kind of person who commands attention or organizes groups, yet people speak to her often. Perhaps it is her steadiness, the unspoken message that she will respond with calm even when the news is bad. She thanks the neighbor and promises to alert the warden when he passes through later. As she works, the older woman watches with a mixture of pride and sorrow. You see her reach out once, calling the young woman back for a moment's rest. The young woman kneels beside her, listening to a soft remark you cannot hear. She gives a gentle smile, squeezes the older woman's hand, and then returns to her tasks. They are small exchanges, but they hold the emotional architecture of their relationship: care, trust, duty, and quiet affection. Later, as the sun lifts higher, she returns inside to tackle the interior repairs. You follow at a respectful distance, passing neighbors carrying buckets of water, boards for bracing walls, or salvaged belongings wrapped in blankets. The building feels alive again, though strained, an organism knitting itself back together with the collective effort of every resident. Inside her apartment, she begins by clearing the largest fragments of plaster into a woven basket. She pauses only briefly to stretch her back before moving to the cracked cupboard. The hinge, bent and stubborn, resists her attempts to straighten it. She breathes out slowly, then tries again, applying steady pressure until it gives. When the door closes more or less properly, she nods once, not proud but satisfied enough to continue. Midway through the repairs, a sudden noise, a dropped bucket from upstairs, startles the older woman, who calls out anxiously. The young woman responds immediately, leaving her tools behind and crossing the room in a few quick strides. She reassures the older woman with a calm voice and a touch to her shoulder. Only when the older woman's breathing steadies does she return to her work. Moments like these repeat often. It's clear she has learned to balance physical tasks with emotional tending, holding both roles without complaint. As afternoon approaches, she sits for the first time in hours. The room is cleaner, more orderly, though still bearing scars the repairs cannot hide. She studies the space in silence, the patched cracks, the neatly stacked salvage, the rearranged furniture. It is not the home it once was, but through her labor, it becomes livable again. You recognize something in her expression then, not hope exactly, but determination wrapped in acceptance. She cannot stop the destruction. She cannot prevent the next raid. But she can restore enough order to make the room feel like theirs again, despite everything. Outside, the city continues its quiet hum of repair. Inside, she rises once more to check the blackout curtains, adjusting the fabric so it will hold through the evening. The light is fading. Another night is coming. But for now, for this moment, she has done what she can. The work of repair never fully heals the wounds, but it keeps life moving, and that is enough to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Ration lines and the quiet arithmetic of survival. You see her the next morning in the ration line, standing with the same composed posture she carries into every task. The older woman sits on a low stool beside her, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the cold. The line stretches down the street and around the corner, a slow-moving column of fatigue and necessity. People speak in low voices, conserving energy, calculating what they might receive and what they will have to go without. She holds her ration cards in one hand and a small cloth bag in the other, the bag folded neatly so it rests flat against her hip. The smell of smoke still lingers from the previous night's fires, and the street bears the marks of fresh damage. Cracked windows patched with cloth. A shattered cart overturned near the curb. A shop sign bent at an angle, the letters distorted by shrapnel. She takes in these details the way she takes in everything, quietly, without outward reaction, as though storing the information for later use. Her eyes move over the line ahead, assessing how long the wait will be, whether the supplies will hold, whether they will need to return tomorrow. The line moves slowly. Children shuffle their feet, restless despite the early hour. A man coughs repeatedly into a handkerchief. A woman behind her murmurs prayers under her breath. She doesn't join in, but the rhythm of the prayer seems to quiet the space around them. When the older woman shifts uncomfortably, she adjusts the shawl on her shoulders and offers a soft word that brings the older woman's gaze back into focus. As they approach the front of the line, the tension thickens. Supplies have been inconsistent for weeks. Some days bring a small blessing, an extra loaf, a delivery of potatoes, a tin of meat. Other days, the shelves empty before half the line has made it through. Everyone senses the uncertainty. You feel it in the way people lean forward slightly, watching each transaction carefully, estimating what remains. When it is her turn, she sets the ration cards on the counter with precise, deliberate movements. The clerk checks each card, then hands her a loaf of bread, a handful of potatoes, and a small tin of cooking fat. It is not much, but it is enough for today. She accepts the items with a quiet nod and steps aside, making room for the next person before slipping them into her bag. Outside the shop, she helps the older woman stand, then begins the slow walk home. She moves with a protective awareness, shielding the older woman from passing carts and guiding her around patches of broken glass. The weight of the bag is modest, yet she carries it carefully, mindful of the fragile supplies inside. You follow at your own pace, watching how she adjusts to each obstacle without complaint. Back in the courtyard, a neighbor approaches her, asking if she has heard rumors about a new flour shipment expected next week. She listens attentively, but offers no speculation. Rumors are constant. She has learned to rely only on what she sees. The neighbor asks after the older woman, and she answers with a small smile that masks the deeper fatigue beneath. Inside their apartment, she unpacks the food onto the small table, arranging each item in its place. She slices a thin portion of the bread for breakfast, setting it beside a cup of weak tea. The older woman sits quietly, watching with gratitude. The young woman's movements are measured, almost ceremonial. In a world where every meal must be stretched, the act of preparing it becomes its own form of stability. She eats little herself. A small piece of bread, a sip of tea, nothing more. But she ensures the older woman's portion is slightly larger, adding an extra slice without comment. It is a pattern you've seen many times, the quiet selflessness that becomes second nature in households stretched thin by war. After the meal, she wraps the remaining bread in cloth to keep it from drying out. She portions the potatoes into separate bowls, each destined for a different day, and places the tin of fat in a cupboard she reinforces with a folded blanket to help insulate it from the cold. These acts are not just practical. They are the arithmetic of survival, a careful calculation of what must last, what can be spared, and how to make a meager supply carry a family through another week. Rationing demands discipline, and she meets that demand with a steadiness shaped by experience. She doesn't waste. She doesn't indulge. She makes each item count. In her hands, scarcity becomes something structured, manageable, almost orderly. It is not a triumph. Nothing in this life feels like triumph, but it is a kind of quiet mastery. Later, she sits beside the older woman with a bowl of warm water, washing her hands and face with gentle strokes. The older woman leans into the touch, comforted by the ritual. When the water cools, the young woman replaces it without hesitation. You watch her through the doorway, understanding more clearly now how rationing shapes not only meals but the cadence of their entire day, pacing energy, conserving strength, responding to scarcity with a calm rooted not in optimism, but in necessity. In this world, survival is not loud. It is measured in careful portions, quiet endurance, and the steadiness of those who make do with what the war leaves behind. Making do with less, and less again. By afternoon, the limits of the day's ration become clearer. The loaf is small. The potatoes are few. The tin of fat must last far longer than it reasonably can. You see her scanning the shelves in her apartment, not with frustration, but with the practiced eye of someone who has learned to calculate scarcity down to the smallest crumb. Every item carries weight. Every decision echoes through the week. She brings the older woman a cup of thin broth warmed on the stove, stirring it slowly to distribute the last traces of flavor. The older woman sips carefully, closing her eyes for a moment as though savoring something richer than it is. The young woman watches her, waiting to see if she will finish, then quietly eats the portion left behind. It is not intentional generosity. It is simply habit, the body adjusting to hunger in ways the mind no longer wastes energy resisting. Later, she begins the quiet work of stretching ingredients. She lifts the small tin of fat and taps out the slightest measure into a pan, letting it melt before adding scraps saved from previous meals. The scent is faint, barely enough to fill the room, but the warmth it produces seems to ease the older woman into a calmer posture. Each movement is deliberate. She cooks not to satisfy hunger, but to sustain duration, to ensure the food lasts as many days as possible. Neighbors are discussing substitutions. One has traded fabric scraps for a handful of dried beans. Another has found someone willing to barter a spoonful of sugar for a piece of firewood. Bartering has become an economy of necessity, built on improvisation and trust. She listens quietly as the voices drift through the thin walls, but does not join the exchange. She trades rarely, not out of pride, but because she knows every household is stretched thin. She will not take from others unless the need becomes absolute. When she does make substitutions, it is with quiet ingenuity. Leftover bread becomes crumbs. Crumbs become a thickener for soup. Potato peels are saved for broth. Even the water used to boil vegetables is reserved, poured into jars to be used later. Nothing is discarded unless it is truly useless. She turns each small scrap over in her hands before deciding its purpose. In this world, waste is unthinkable. Every fragment might hold potential. As she works, the older woman watches her with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. There is love in her gaze, but also a quiet ache, the knowledge that her daughter-in-law, so young, carries burdens meant for two people. The young woman senses the emotion but never speaks of it. Instead, she offers a warm cloth for the older woman's hands, or a blanket to soften the chill drifting through the cracks in the window frame. Coal is scarce, and the ration never lasts the full week. She heats only one room, the kitchen, and even that sparingly. When the temperature drops, she wraps blankets around their shoulders, lights a single candle, and positions them both close to the stove for whatever warmth it can offer. She checks the floorboards for drafts and stuffs small rags into gaps between the planks. Every touch is purposeful, managing discomfort with the calm acceptance of someone who no longer remembers luxury as anything but a story. Laundry becomes another exercise in adaptation. Water must be fetched from the pump and heated sparingly. Soap is stretched by shaving it into thin slivers. She scrubs each garment by hand, wringing them with quiet efficiency, then hangs them on lines strung across the kitchen. The clothes drip steadily into bowls placed beneath them, nothing wasted, not even the water that carries the day's dirt away. The rhythm of scarcity shapes everything: how she cooks, how she cleans, how she moves through the room, how she plans tomorrow. Even the way she breathes seems calibrated to conserve energy. Yet none of it feels desperate. Her calm does not hide the struggle. It absorbs it, transforming necessity into routine. Late in the evening, as the older woman rests, she checks their supplies once more. A few potatoes, divided for the coming days. A loaf now reduced to half its size. A tin of fat, carefully closed. She folds the cloth around the bread again, tucking it in as though protecting it from the cold. She pauses for a moment. She isn't thinking of hunger or fear. She's calculating, quietly, steadily, how to carry them both through the next few days. This arithmetic of survival has become her second language, measured not in numbers, but in endurance. Through her routine, rationing becomes more than a system. It becomes a way of thinking, a way of living, a discipline that reshapes every moment of the day. She stands in the dim lantern light, gathers the remaining scraps for tomorrow's meals, and closes the cupboard gently, as though sealing away their small measure of stability for the night. The weight that settles in the quiet hours. The psychological toll of the war does not arrive all at once. It settles slowly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces between alarms, in the quiet moments after rationing is done, after repairs are finished, after the older woman has gone to sleep. You notice it first in her posture, not when she is carrying water or navigating rubble, but in the stillness of late evening, when her responsibilities briefly loosen their grip. Her shoulders drop in a way they never do during the day. Her eyes remain open longer than necessary, fixed on a point just beyond reach. She sits at the small table, the lantern casting a muted glow across her face. The older woman sleeps in the corner, her breathing shallow but steady. The silence here is different from the bunker silence. There is no imminent threat, no expectation of explosions, no claustrophobic proximity to others. But the quiet is not restful. It amplifies thoughts she cannot afford to dwell on while she is moving. You see her trace a crack in the table with the tip of her finger, following its shape absently. The gesture looks simple, almost idle, but the heaviness in it is unmistakable. A woman sorting through fears she rarely allows to surface. Will tomorrow's line have food? Will the next raid hit closer? Will her husband write? Will he come home? Will she manage if the older woman's health fails further? These questions accumulate like dust, gathering in corners of her mind. When a sound outside startles her, a distant cart rattling on stones, nothing more, she flinches before catching herself. The body reacts faster than reassurance can. You see the instinctive fear in her eyes, the reflex shaped by too many nights when harmless noises preceded catastrophe. The emotional fatigue does not make her fragile. It sharpens her, in some ways. But it costs her something. Small moments of stillness pull memories forward. Quieter times, routines that once felt effortless, a future she expected to build with her husband before the war rewrote all plans. She does not indulge the memories long. The war has taught her the discipline of turning away from what cannot be reclaimed. During the day, she carries herself with steadiness. But here, in these late hours, you see the subtle tremors, the signs of a mind stretched thin. She closes her eyes for a moment, pressing her fingers gently to her temples. She inhales slowly, then opens them again, grounding herself in the room. She does not cry. Tears would offer no relief. She has learned to absorb her fear and transform it into action. Fatigue weaves itself through her thoughts. Not the physical exhaustion of climbing stairs or carrying water, but the deeper fatigue of always being on alert. Even in sleep, her senses never fully rest. Her ears remain tuned for the sirens. Her body remains ready to move. She sleeps lightly, rising at the slightest shift in the building structure, the smallest tremor that might signal danger. The older woman stirs in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. The young woman is beside her instantly, adjusting her blanket, touching her forehead, whispering a reassurance meant as much for herself as for the older woman. Once the older woman settles again, the young woman returns to the table, but her composure is thinner now. A lantern flickers. She reaches out to steady the wick, then watches the flame right itself. The movement seems to calm her. She aligns the ration cards in a neat stack, then folds the cloth that covers the remaining bread. These rituals are small, but they anchor her mind, giving her something tangible to hold when her thoughts begin to drift toward fear. The psychological weight is not a single burden. It is an accumulation. It grows in the gaps between tasks, in the silence after repairs, in the nocturnal hours when the city lies shadowed and tense. Eventually, she extinguishes the lantern. In the darkness, she sits for a moment longer, listening to the breath of the older woman, the creak of the settling building, the distant hum of a city bracing itself for whatever comes next. Then she stands, checks the basket by the door as she always does, and lies down beside the older woman, not to sleep, but to rest in a way that keeps her ready. The weight she carries will rise with her at dawn, and she will shoulder it again, quietly, without hesitation. What she carries inside. By the next morning, life resumes as if the night's unease were just another layer folded into the day. But you can still see traces of the quiet struggle she endured in the hours before dawn. They linger in the slower way she ties her headscarf, in the careful pause she takes before lifting the older woman from her bed, in the faint hollowness beneath her eyes that no amount of rest can soften. The psychological weight she carries does not vanish in daylight. Instead, it reshapes itself into the coping behaviors she performs almost automatically. You see it in the way she checks the blackout curtains repeatedly, even though the sun is high. You see it in her habit of touching the doorframe gently before stepping outside, as though grounding herself in something solid. You see it in the way her breathing changes whenever an engine growls in the distance, a subtle tightening of her posture, a quiet readiness tucked beneath her calm exterior. The older woman senses this, too. She watches the younger woman more closely now, offering small smiles, asking fewer questions, leaning into her arm with a tenderness that acknowledges both gratitude and concern. The young woman never discourages this attention, but she does not dwell in it either. She carries her worries inward, folded carefully into the corners of her thoughts where they will not interfere with the tasks she must complete. Throughout the day, moments of vulnerability appear briefly, almost invisibly. When she kneels to scrub soot from the floor, her hand pauses for a fraction of a second too long. When she slices the day's portion of bread, her eyes linger on the smallness of the ration. When she stands by the window, watching neighbors assess their own damage, her gaze drifts upward as though imagining the sky she once trusted to hold nothing but clouds. These moments pass quickly, but they accumulate, and because she does not speak of them, they remain inside her, unshared, unsmoothed by conversation. She finds steadiness in routine. The repetition of tasks becomes a form of psychological scaffolding. Washing laundry, stirring soup, mending a tear, checking on the older woman's breathing. These actions anchor her, giving shape to days that might otherwise dissolve into anxiety. Routine is not escape, it is survival. But beneath the surface, other strategies form. You notice how she sometimes reaches for an object that holds emotional weight, a photograph tucked behind a jar, a letter folded and refolded so many times that the edges have begun to soften. She does not linger on these for long. She lets herself feel whatever rises, longing, fear, memory, then returns them to their place with a steadying breath. In the courtyard, When neighbors gather to exchange small fragments of news, she listens more than she speaks. She hears rumors of cities burned, of shortages worsening, of letters that never arrived. She absorbs this information with the same restrained composure she shows in every part of her life. But you can sense how each piece of news adds another layer to the weight she carries. Her emotions do not flare outward. They draw inward, shaping a private landscape of quiet endurance. The older woman occasionally touches her hand, offering a grounding presence. The gesture is small, but it reveals the underlying truth of their relationship. Each depends on the other. One for physical care, the other for emotional purpose. They are two lives held together by necessity, but also by a bond forged through repeated acts of mutual trust. In the early evening, as she prepares the stove for another modest meal, a distant rumble rolls across the sky. Not a siren, not yet, but enough to bring tension into her shoulders. She sets down the pot, crosses to the window, and listens. You watch the transformation, the way her breath catches, the way she tilts her head slightly, trying to decipher the direction of the sound. When the noise fades without warning, her composure returns, but something in her eyes stays sharpened. She returns to her tasks, but her movements are more deliberate now. You can feel the shift, the subtle readiness that comes from recognizing how fragile each sense of calm truly is. She does not fear the next raid. Fear implies choice. Instead, she anticipates it, preparing her mind for the moment when routine will dissolve into urgency. Later that night, she sits with the older woman in the dim glow of a candle, her expression softer than before. The older woman's hand rests on hers, their fingers intertwined. Neither speaks. The silence between them feels purposeful, a space where words would fall short, where presence alone offers comfort. In that stillness, you understand how much she carries internally. Not despair. That would require surrender. What lives inside her is something more complex, a blend of vigilance, weariness, determination, and a longing for a peace she rarely allows herself to imagine. She extinguishes the candle, guides the older woman to bed, and then stands for a moment longer in the dark, her face faintly illuminated by the glow from the street. Her eyes reflect not just fatigue, but a quiet strength shaped by every night she has endured. The weight she carries does not break her. It shapes her, and she meets it again and again with the same quiet resolve. The first glimpse of a changed world. The morning after a heavy raid, the city feels suspended, not fully awake, not entirely broken, caught in a fragile balance between what has survived and what has been lost. You see her step outside with the older woman, moving more slowly today, as though bracing for what the daylight might reveal. Even before she looks down the street, you sense in her posture a quiet readiness for bad news. The air is sharp with smoke. Ash drifts lightly across the courtyard, settling on shawls and windowsills like a grim snowfall. People gather in small knots, their faces drawn, their voices hushed. They speak not with excitement or panic, but with the subdued tone of people who have grown accustomed to confronting damage before breakfast. She pauses at the threshold, guiding the older woman's hand to the railing. Only when the older woman is steady does she raise her eyes to the scene ahead. A building 2 streets over has collapsed entirely, its facade crumbled into a mound of brick and twisted beams. A roof lies folded inward like a punctured lung. Windows blown from their frames glitter across the pavement. A horse-drawn cart overturned during the night sits at an odd angle, one wheel still spinning faintly from the morning wind. She studies the destruction without flinching, not because it doesn't affect her, but because she has learned that emotion must be paced. There is too much to do, too much to manage, too many tasks waiting. Shock is a luxury she cannot afford. As she and the older woman walk down the street, you follow at a distance, noting how others glance toward her. Not expecting her to lead, not looking for instruction, but acknowledging her steadiness. People gravitate toward those who seem rooted, even when the ground is unstable. She stops occasionally to assess damage along the way. A leaning chimney. A shattered window precariously held by its last splinter of wood. A staircase partially blocked by fallen plaster. She traces the contours of these hazards with her eyes, weighing whether they pose immediate danger. Each evaluation is quick, instinctive. She has built an internal map of risk from months of living in a war zone. Neighbors emerge onto balconies and doorsteps, their expressions shadowed with fatigue. A woman calls down to her, asking if she has seen the family who lived in the corner unit. She shakes her head gently, offering a sympathetic look but no speculation. Rumors and assumptions tear at communities faster than bombs. She knows to avoid feeding either. When the warden arrives with a clipboard, she listens carefully as he outlines which areas must be avoided and which walls may still collapse. The older woman clutches her arm tighter, unsettled by the sternness of his voice. The young woman responds by placing her hand soothingly on the older woman's back, a small gesture that restores some measure of calm. As they continue walking, you see children gathering bricks, building small towers along the edge of the courtyard. Their play is subdued, their movements slow, but the instinct to create persistently pushes through the wreckage. She pauses to watch them for a moment, her expression softening just slightly. The older woman notices too, and for an instant her face brightens. These tiny signs of continuity matter more than anyone admits aloud. Then they reach the stretch of road where the devastation deepens. A house has been split open, its interior exposed like a cross-section in a book. A bed sits at an impossible angle, half suspended above the rubble. A wardrobe has toppled, spilling clothes into the dust. Someone has placed a single chair upright in front of the ruins, a silent marker of what once was. She hesitates here, just long enough for the older woman to notice the tension in her hand. You observe her jaw tighten, her breath draw in just slightly. She is seeing not just destruction, but the echo of her own vulnerabilities. Homes like hers, families like hers, futures like hers. But she does not allow the moment to take hold. After a quiet exhale, she guides the older woman onward. As they return to their building, she crouches to examine a crack in the exterior wall. It has widened since yesterday. Without a word, she reaches for a small piece of chalk she keeps in her pocket, a simple tool used by many residents to track structural changes. She marks the edge of the crack with a thin line. If it expands by tomorrow, she will know. She always knows. When she helps the older woman back inside, her movements are gentler than before, as though the morning sights have made her more aware of fragility, not in herself, but in everything around them. From your vantage point in the hallway, you see her pause before closing the door. Her eyes drift briefly toward the staircase, toward the world outside, toward the destruction that has settled like a weight on the whole neighborhood. Then she closes the door softly, as if sealing the room against the harshness of the morning. The world beyond it may be fractured, but inside, she will rebuild whatever she can. Sorting through ruins, one fragile memory at a time. Inside the apartment, she pauses for a moment to let the older woman settle into her chair. The morning's walk has taken more strength from both of them than she allows herself to admit. The older woman exhales shakily, her hands trembling slightly from the cold and the shock of what they saw outside. The young woman kneels beside her, smoothing her shawl and offering a warm touch to her shoulder before standing again to face the room. The damage is not catastrophic, but it is always enough to feel like a setback. A small cascade of plaster along the wall, soot streaks across the floorboards, a cracked frame where a picture fell overnight. Nothing here surprises her anymore, But each new wound the room carries represents one more thing to mend, one more layer of strain to absorb. You watch her approach the scattered debris with quiet determination. She begins by picking up the photograph that lies face down beneath the table, the same wedding portrait she rescued days ago. It survived again, though the glass has cracked further, splintering across the image like a map of all the places life has fractured since that day. She brushes the dust from the bride's dress with gentle fingers, then sets the frame upright on the table. She doesn't look at it long. Looking too long invites longing, and longing is more dangerous than any falling plaster. Next, she moves to the shelf where books have fallen in uneven stacks. She sets them upright again, tapping each one lightly against the wood to shake out the grit that has drifted between their pages. The older woman watches her with soft, tired eyes. There is a fragile comfort in seeing the younger woman restore these familiar shapes, the small rituals that reclaim the room from disorder. When she bends to gather broken pieces of pottery from the floor, she doesn't discard them immediately. She turns each fragment in her hand, assessing whether it can be mended with string or heat or a bit of glue someone might loan her. Only when she is certain a piece is beyond repair does she set it aside. Her instinct is always toward preservation, not because the objects themselves matter, but because each repaired thing becomes a quiet declaration. The war can take much, but not everything. She moves with a rhythm, slow, steady, deliberate. Each task is a way of reasserting control in a world that constantly strips it away. She gathers fallen soot with a damp cloth, wipes the surfaces with practiced strokes, sweeps debris into piles that she arranges along the wall. Her actions are not hurried. They are thoughtful, measured, almost meditative in their repetition. Occasionally, she pauses to check on the older woman. A nod, a touch to the hand, a whispered reassurance. These brief exchanges form the emotional scaffolding that holds the two of them upright. The older woman's gratitude is visible in her gaze, in the way she reaches out as the younger woman passes, her fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve for the comfort of closeness. As the room slowly returns to a semblance of order, neighbors drift past the open doorway, offering updates about the damage farther down the street. Someone mentions a family who lost everything. Someone else reports that the bakery's windows shattered, but the oven still works. The young woman listens, nodding where appropriate, but does not leave her tasks. She cannot carry anyone else's burdens today. She is managing enough of her own. At one point, she stops beside the window and touches the jagged edge of a broken pane. Her reflection appears in the remaining glass, thinner now, more worn, the faint shadow of worry living permanently between her brows. She inhales slowly and steps back. The damage can be patched with cloth for now. The winter drafts will seep through, but she has weathered worse. When the major cleaning is done, she kneels to inspect the crack in the wall, the same one she traced with her fingertip the night before. It has widened. Only slightly, but enough for her to notice. Enough for her to worry. She presses her palm gently against the plaster, as though trying to feel the building's pulse. It holds. For now. She marks its edge with chalk again, then stands, wiping her hands on her apron. The older woman watches her intently. She knows what the chalk means. She knows what widening cracks can signal. But neither of them speaks. Words would only make the fear more real. Finally, she sits beside the older woman, taking her hand in a gesture of quiet reassurance. The room is not whole, but it is theirs again. It has survived another night, and so have they. As she sits there, you sense in her a complex mixture of resignation and resolve. She cannot stop the destruction. She cannot protect everything she cares about, but she can restore small pieces of her world each morning, and in doing so, she gathers the strength to face whatever darkness comes next. The war fractures their lives daily. She answers by piecing them back together. One quiet gesture, one repaired object, one deep breath at a time. Scarcity in every corner of the day. By the time afternoon settles in, the reality of scarcity makes itself felt in every corner of her routine. You see it not only in the small portion meals or the thin slices of bread, but in the way she moves through her home with an awareness of limits so deeply ingrained it has become instinct. Nothing is wasted. Every item is evaluated for how long it can serve, how far it can stretch, how many purposes it might fulfill before it is truly gone. She begins by checking their supplies with the quiet precision of someone who has repeated this ritual hundreds of times. The small tin of fat is opened, examined, and closed again without using any. The remaining potatoes, 3 uneven in size, are set on the table and touched lightly, as though she can gauge their potential simply by weighing them in her hand. The loaf of bread wrapped in cloth is unwrapped briefly, inspected for dryness, then wrapped again and placed carefully in the coolest corner of the room. The older woman watches her with a mix of trust and regret. She remembers days when food was plentiful enough that meals were chosen, not rationed, when bread was bought fresh, not stretched across a week, when cooking involved flavor rather than strict arithmetic. But she does not speak these memories aloud. The young woman carries enough weight without being reminded of what once was. When the young woman begins preparing the midday meal, the kitchen fills with the faintest aroma, thin broth simmering on the stove, enhanced by leftover vegetable water saved from the day before. She drops in a small handful of dried herbs, more for comfort than flavor, and lets the steam rise in soft curls toward the cracked ceiling. The older woman inhales the scent as if drawing warmth directly into her chest. As she stirs, her eyes drift toward the window, scanning the street below. A coal delivery cart rattles by, its wheels creaking under the weight of a meager supply. She watches, calculating silently whether she has enough coal left to last through the week. Her gaze shifts to the stove, then to the small pile of coal in the corner. She knows the answer before she even counts. They will need to conserve more than ever. Her coping strategies unfold quietly. She lights the stove only long enough to warm the broth, then extinguishes the flame. She breaks the bread into 2 thin slices, giving the larger one to the older woman without hesitation. She eats slowly, deliberately, dividing her portion into smaller bites so it lasts longer. The older woman tries to offer her a bit of her own slice, but the young woman gives a gentle shake of her head, her smile soft but firm. After the meal, she places the leftover broth into a small jar, sealing it tightly. Nothing is discarded, not even the water used to rinse the pot. She pours it into another jar for future use in washing or cooking. These acts may seem small, but each one forms a protective layer against the uncertainty of the coming days. Later, she takes out a garment in need of mending. The sleeve is torn, and the fabric has thinned from repeated wear. She sits near the window to catch the afternoon light, threading a needle with quiet concentration. Each stitch is small, tight, and deliberate. The rhythm seems to soothe her, grounding her mind as her hands work. The older woman watches, recognizing this ritual as one of the young woman's few moments of internal rest, not relaxation, but focus that softens the edges of fatigue. Outside, you hear neighbors discussing rumors of shortages. Less flour next week, fewer potatoes, soap nearly impossible to find. The young woman listens without joining the conversation. Rumors are air, constant, shifting, unreliable. She prefers to depend on what she can measure in her cupboard, in her basket, in the palm of her hand. When the older woman asks whether they have enough for tomorrow, the younger woman answers with calm assurance. She always does. She does not lie, but she frames the truth gently. We have enough for today. And tomorrow we will manage. As dusk approaches, she begins preparing for the blackout. She checks the fabric over the windows, tightening the edges so no light escapes. She tests the lantern's wick, ensuring it will burn slowly and sparingly. She gathers the emergency basket near the door, documents, a blanket, a few biscuits, making sure nothing is missing. These routines are as reflexive as breathing, shaped by months of adapting to scarcity and danger. The older woman leans back in her chair, her eyes heavy with fatigue. The young woman touches her shoulder softly, offering reassurance through presence rather than words. Then she returns to the table, examining what little remains of their supplies with a quiet steadiness that defines her entire life now. Scarcity circles every part of her day, but she meets it with discipline and care, shaping each hour into something survivable. Where others might see deprivation, she sees structure, a set of constraints she must navigate so the two of them can endure another night, another morning, another uncertain stretch of days. Her world has narrowed to essentials, yet within that narrowness she finds a kind of strength, the ability to make the most fragile routines hold, even when everything around her threatens to fracture. Blackouts and the quiet defense of the home. By the time evening settles over the neighborhood, the blackout preparations are already underway. You see her securing the layers of fabric over the windows, pulling the heavy cloth taut so no glimmer of light can slip through the seams. The older woman sits nearby, watching her work with silent understanding. This ritual has become as essential as breathing, a nightly defense shaped by caution, habit, and the memory of what a single mistake could mean. When she finishes with the windows, she lowers the lantern's wick until the flame shrinks to a faint, steady glow. The dimness softens the lines of her face, making her look momentarily younger, though the weariness in her shoulders remains. The blackout changes the rhythm of life. Tasks that would take minutes in daylight require slow, careful navigation. She moves through the room with deliberate steps, one hand tracing along the walls to keep her bearings. The older woman follows her movements, comforted by the sound of soft footfalls and the rustle of fabric. In the darkness, sounds from the street carry differently. A neighbor closing a door, a distant clatter of boots, the faint scrape of someone adjusting a shutter that refuses to stay closed. Each noise makes her pause briefly, listening for the undertone that distinguishes everyday sounds from danger. Her body has become a tuning fork, attuned to frequencies of threat that others might overlook. She lights a second candle only long enough to heat a small pot of water. The flame is shielded carefully by her hand, her body angled so none of its glow reaches the curtains. Even a moment of carelessness could bring a reprimand from the wardens patrolling outside, or worse, draw unwanted attention if enemy pilots scan the streets from above. She works swiftly, extinguishing the flame as soon as the water warms. The older woman relaxes when offered the warm cloth, pressing it gently to her face. The heat seems to ease the tension in her shoulders. The young woman watches her for a moment, then sits across from her, sipping her own cup of warm water, not a luxury, but a comfort that helps soften the cold. In the silence that follows, the blackout becomes almost peaceful. Not restful, but intimate, a closeness shaped by necessity, where voices drop naturally into softer tones and movements become more mindful. You sense how the darkness forces a reorientation of the mind, turning attention inward, narrowing the world to a circle of faint lantern light and familiar breathing. But beneath the quiet, vigilance remains. The young woman listens constantly, to the older woman's breaths, to the distant echoes of footsteps, to the subtle creaks of the building settling after days of strain. Her awareness does not subside simply because the night is calm. Calm is often the hour before the siren. She keeps their emergency basket near the door, checking its contents once more. Documents, a blanket, a small tin of biscuits, a folded scarf. Her fingers linger on the scarf, a soft, well-worn piece of fabric that holds memory and comfort. Then she closes the basket gently. As darkness deepens, she guides the older woman to the bed, helping her lie down slowly to avoid aggravating her aching joints. She tucks the blanket around her, smoothing the edges with a tenderness that speaks to more than routine. The older woman's hand rises briefly, brushing the young woman's cheek. For a moment, the young woman leans into the touch, allowing herself the briefest release of tension before stepping back. When she finally sits at the table, she does so in near silence. The lantern flame flickers softly, casting shadows that dance across the walls. She folds her hands in front of her, steadying herself in the dim light. There is nothing left to do for now, no task to occupy her hands, no immediate danger demanding action. The stillness is heavy. Through the thin blackout fabric, you hear the muted hum of the city enduring its own version of the night. Somewhere a baby cries briefly before being soothed. A pair of neighbors whispers about ration rumors. A bicycle rattles down the cobblestones, its tires hissing through debris. Life continues, but always under constraint. She listens to these sounds with a face that reveals only the slightest shifts, a tightening of her brow at a distant explosion from another district, a softening when the wind carries the scent of something familiar, perhaps bread from a bakery still attempting to operate. But most often, she waits. Not passively, but with a readiness shaped by months of nights like this, where calm can pivot to chaos in the span of a single siren. Waiting becomes its own form of endurance, its own test of composure. Eventually, she dims the lantern further, bringing the room into an almost complete darkness. She sits for a moment longer, allowing her mind to settle, then lies beside the older woman, her arm draped lightly across her as a protective instinct. The blackout holds the city in a quiet, heavy pause, a moment suspended between danger and reprieve. And in that suspended stillness, she becomes the anchor of the room, a quiet guardian through the long hours until morning. Letters that do not come. By the next morning, the weight of uncertainty has deepened. Not the uncertainty of raids or ration lines, these have become routine, but the quieter, more personal kind that settles around the absence of news. You see her pause at the base of the stairwell, scanning the row of mail slots with a familiar mixture of hope and restraint. The older woman stands beside her, leaning heavily on the rail, her eyes fixed on the same small compartment they check every day. It is empty. Again. She does not sigh, does not slump, does not allow her disappointment to show in any outward gesture. Instead, she closes the slot gently, almost reverently, as if careful handling will somehow coax a letter into existence. The older woman touches her arm softly, a small gesture of shared understanding. They both know how long it has been. As they walk back toward the apartment, her steps are slightly slower, her gaze lower. The absence of letters is not new, but each day without news carves a subtle hollow deeper inside her. The war has taught her to expect silence, yet hope finds its way into her routine, returning each morning like a persistent visitor she cannot turn away. Inside, she sets the kettle on the stove, lighting it with the smallest possible flame to preserve their coal. As the water warms, she reaches into the cupboard and removes a small tin box. It once held sweets, long since gone, and now contains neatly folded letters wrapped in a strip of cloth. She opens the tin just enough to glimpse the edges of the paper, the handwriting she knows by touch alone. She does not read them. She never does during the day. Reading invites longing, and longing weakens resolve. Instead, she closes the tin and places it carefully at the back of the shelf. The older woman watches her with sad familiarity. She has witnessed this ritual too many times to misunderstand it. At breakfast, the silence between them holds a tension neither can name. The older woman eats slowly, her appetite diminished by worry. The young woman notices and quietly offers her the larger portion, though she herself has eaten little. When the older woman attempts to protest, The young woman gives a small shake of her head and a faint smile, an answer that allows no argument. Later, as she prepares the day's tasks, you sense how her emotions shift beneath the surface. She moves with her usual precision, but there is an inwardness to her today, a subtle withdrawal that places her in two worlds at once, the present moment and the distant unknown where the man she loves is either safe, or wounded, or already beyond reach. Routines continue. They must. She checks the window coverings, repairs a fraying seam on the older woman's shawl, sweeps the hall outside their door. But small cracks appear in her composure. When she sits to thread a needle, her hand hesitates briefly. When she lifts the broom, her breath falters for just a moment. These breaks are tiny, almost invisible, but you see them clearly because you have learned her rhythms. Neighbors discuss rumors of wounded soldiers returning from the front. Some whisper about hospitals overcrowded with casualties. Others speak of transport routes disrupted by bombings, delaying mail even further. She listens, but she does not ask questions. She has learned that rumors offer only two outcomes: false hope or sharpened fear. She accepts neither. Later in the afternoon, she steps outside to shake dust from a blanket. She pauses in the courtyard, staring toward the street where the postman usually appears. Her expression remains composed, but something in her posture betrays the thought she will not speak aloud. What if the letters have stopped because he no longer can write? The older woman approaches slowly, leaning on her cane. She stands beside the young woman and offers a soft, weary reassurance. The young woman listens but does not respond. Her silence is not rejection, it is preservation. Words, once spoken, might crack the fragile layer keeping her fear contained. As they return inside, she closes the door gently, resting her hand on the wood for a moment before turning the key. The gesture is small, but meaningful, a way of grounding herself, of reclaiming the space as a refuge from the uncertainty outside. That evening, after the older woman has gone to bed, she takes the tin box from the cupboard and sits at the table. The lantern flickers softly, illuminating the folded letters. This time she allows herself to unfold one, just one, and read a few lines. The ink is faded, the paper worn, but the words still carry the warmth of someone who loved her in a world that felt stable. She reads only long enough to steady her breath, then returns the letter to the tin and wraps the cloth around it with the utmost care. The box is not a treasure. It is an anchor, a small, fragile proof that connection once existed and might exist again. But tonight, as she places it back on the shelf, her hands linger just a moment longer than usual. Fear in the silence between words. The next days unfold with an unnerving sameness. No letters, no news, no confirmation of anything at all. Silence, once merely disappointing, begins to take on a sharper edge, a shape capable of cutting into her thoughts. You see the change before she does, in the small tension that now lives between her movements, as if she is bracing herself for something she refuses to name. The older woman senses it too. She watches the younger woman closely, her eyes lingering on her hands as she works, on her face when she pauses, on her posture when she stands at the window a moment too long. The absence of news has become its own kind of presence, a shadow that enters the room before either of them speak. One morning, while sweeping the entry hall, she hears footsteps echoing through the stairwell, quick, uneven, too purposeful to be a neighbor. She freezes mid-motion, holding her breath. For a heartbeat, you see fear flash through her eyes. What if it's an official? What if the news that does come is the kind no one wants to receive? But the footsteps pass. Just a boy delivering coal to another apartment. She exhales silently and resumes sweeping, but you can tell the moment has unsettled her more deeply than she will admit. Inside, the older woman asks quietly, "Did the post come?" The younger woman shakes her head with a carefully neutral expression. She answers gently, but the older woman recognizes restraint when she hears it. She reaches out, squeezing the young woman's wrist with a frail, trembling hand. The gesture carries more comfort than words could offer. As the day continues, the young woman tries to anchor herself in routine. She washes laundry, mends a kitchen towel, checks the cupboard with the same composed method she always has. But today the movements lack their usual steadiness. Her hands shake when she threads the needle. Her breath catches when a pot clatters against the stove. She miscounts potatoes before correcting herself with a frustrated blink. Grief has not arrived, but the fear of grief presses on her with an almost physical weight. In the afternoon, when neighbors gather in the courtyard, talk shifts toward soldiers missing in action, delayed postal routes, and rumors of heavy fighting near his division. She stands among them, silent, her expression polite but impenetrable. She doesn't ask questions. She knows any answer could become a wound she cannot easily close. But one comment makes her still. A woman mentions that mail delays often precede difficult news. The young woman's face remains controlled, but her posture tightens, her hands drawing close to her body as if protecting something fragile inside her. She steps away politely, returning to the stairwell before her composure can slip. Back in the apartment, she prepares tea for the older woman, her movements more mechanical now. When the older woman thanks her, the young woman offers a small smile, but it is thin, shaped more by duty than emotion. After the older woman naps, the young woman sits at the table with her mending basket. She arranges the items inside, thread, needles, cloth scraps, then rearranges them again without purpose. Her mind is far from the table. Her gaze drifts often toward the shelf where the tin box is hidden. She doesn't reach for it, not yet, but her body angles subtly in its direction, as if the letters inside are calling to her. She forces herself back to her tasks. She stitches a seam. She patches a tear. Her fingers move with practiced skill, but her thoughts remain suspended in the same fraught unknown. If no letter comes, does that mean the worst? Or merely that the world has fallen too far into chaos for words to find their way to her? By evening, the silence becomes unbearable. She retrieves the tin box and brings it to the table. This time, she does not wait for the lantern to dim or for the older woman to sleep. She opens it slowly, running her fingers along the folded edges of each letter as though trying to feel something familiar in their weight. She unfolds one, smoothing it flat with gentle hands. But tonight, the words do not soothe her. They feel distant, belonging to a world too far removed from the one she now inhabits. The promises of return, the jokes about ration queues, the soft declarations of love, all of them feel suspended in a time she cannot quite reach. Her eyes begin to hurt, not from tears, she does not cry, but from the effort of holding everything inside. When she refolds the letter, she does so with more care than usual, aligning the edges perfectly before placing it back into the tin. She closes the box with a soft click, sets it on the table, and rests both hands on its lid. For a moment, she allows herself a single, quiet breath, an exhale that carries the weight of all she cannot voice. Then she stands, returns the box to its place on the shelf, and begins preparing the blackout for the night. She does not know whether the silence means loss or delay. But tonight, the uncertainty feels like a shadow that stretches farther than the room itself. Rumors, and the way fear travels through a city. Rumors begin the way most dangers do in wartime, quietly, almost politely. A phrase overheard at the pump. A whisper exchanged in a ration line. A hurried conversation that stops abruptly when someone unfamiliar approaches. In a city under bombardment, rumors travel faster than facts, and they often strike deeper. You see the shift immediately in the younger woman's posture when she steps into the courtyard that morning. Conversations around her are tighter, voices lowered, faces drawn with a new kind of worry. At first, she cannot make out the words. Neighbors cluster in small knots, turning their bodies inward, glancing toward the street as if expecting something. The older woman grips the railing beside her, uneasy. The air itself feels different, less like the stillness before a raid, and more like the moment before a truth no one wants to hear. Then the fragments reach her. Heavy losses. Several units cut off. Mail halted again. A whole regiment missing. The words are vague, but their tone is unmistakable. Something has shifted at the front. She does not react outwardly. She stands with composed stillness, listening without appearing to listen. But you notice the way her fingers curl just slightly at her side, the subtle tightening of the muscles around her jaw. The older woman looks at her anxiously, waiting for reassurance. The young woman offers a quiet smile, small, steady, but thinner than usual. A neighbor approaches with deliberate steps. A man in his late 50s, always kind, always careful with his words. He greets them softly, then lowers his voice. They say the division near Lviv took heavy casualties. No confirmed lists yet, but some women are already waiting at the district office. The young woman's breath stills for a moment, almost imperceptibly, before she inhales again. She thanks him politely, her voice calm, measured. She does not ask questions. She will not risk hearing speculation shaped by fear rather than truth. But the older woman understands the implication. She squeezes the young woman's hand, her eyes wet with dread she cannot hide. The young woman responds by guiding her gently toward a bench, seating her with a care that masks her own trembling undercurrent of fear. Once the older woman is settled, the young woman steps aside for a moment, moving to the edge of the courtyard where fewer people stand. She does not pace, does not wring her hands. She simply stands in the cold morning light, looking toward the distant street where the postman usually appears, where families gather on days when news, good or terrible, is expected. You sense her thoughts unfolding behind her stillness. If his regiment is affected, if the rumors are true, if the mail has been stopped because they cannot confirm who survived, she does not let the thoughts complete themselves. She cuts them off sharply, the way one clamps down on a wound before it bleeds too quickly. A woman approaches, someone she knows well. Her face is pale. They say lists might be posted soon, the woman whispers. At the commandant's office. The young woman does not flinch, but her eyes narrow by a fraction, not in anger, but in focus. She thanks the woman and turns away, her expression unreadable. When she returns to the older woman, she kneels beside her. "We will wait," she says softly. Her tone is steady. Her hands, however, shake very slightly as they settle over the older woman's. Inside the apartment, her composure begins to crack at the edges. She sets her shawl on the table, but forgets to fold it. She fills a pot with water, then sets it down without lighting the stove. She checks the window coverings twice, then a third time. These are not routines. These are reflexes driven by unrest. For a moment, she stands in the middle of the room, unsure where to direct her hands. You see the war's pressure closing in from all sides, not through bombs or hunger this time, but through a possibility so painful she cannot even allow herself to speak it. The older woman watches her with a fragile, silent grief. She has seen this fear before, decades earlier, in another war. She recognizes the particular stillness, the particular way the younger woman breathes. Shallow, steady, deliberately controlled. Finally, the young woman forces herself back into motion. She begins straightening the room, not because it needs to be straightened, but because order gives her something to hold on to. She picks up the shawl. She folds it carefully. She aligns the cups on the shelf. She checks the emergency basket again. These small acts are not about tidiness. They are about anchoring herself against a tide of fear that threatens to rise too quickly. As the morning wears on, the rumor spreads beyond the courtyard. You hear it in the market line, in the hushed conversations of women clutching ration cards, in the way people glance nervously at the sky as if expecting news to fall from it. Each retelling adds uncertainty. Each uncertainty deepens her dread. And yet she does not break. She does not panic. She does not let the older woman see how deeply the silence has pierced her. Instead, she sets the kettle on the stove again, lighting the flame this time, and begins preparing tea. Not because tea will steady her, but because making it is something she can control in a world that feels suddenly, terrifyingly uncontrollable. Waiting for news that might break a life. By late afternoon, the rumor has settled over the neighborhood like a heavy fog. No one knows anything for certain, yet everyone behaves as though confirmation is only a breath away. Women hover by windows, their eyes darting toward the street. Men return home early from what work they still have, sensing their families need the reassurance of their presence. Even children play more quietly, absorbing the tension in the air without understanding its cause. Inside the apartment, she sits at the table with the older woman, a pot of weak tea between them. Neither drinks. The older woman folds and refolds the edge of her shawl, her hands shaking slightly. The young woman keeps her posture steady, her back straight, her gaze soft but unfocused, as if she is looking at something far beyond the walls, something only she can see. A knock echoes faintly from somewhere in the building, a simple, ordinary sound, but it makes her flinch. She turns her head sharply toward the door, breath held, waiting to hear whether footsteps approach their apartment. When none do, she exhales, but the tremor in her hand betrays her. The older woman reaches across the table, placing her trembling hand on the young woman's. The gesture is small but carries the weight of unspoken fear. "He is strong," the older woman murmurs. "He will come home." The young woman nods, but her eyes lower to the table. She does not speak. To speak would mean choosing between truth and hope, and she cannot bear the burden of that choice. After a moment, she stands and begins tidying the kitchen again, though nothing is out of place. She rearranges the cups, straightens the cloth on the table, moves the tin box on the shelf a fraction of an inch, then sets it back. Each action is precise, controlled, a way to keep the rising tide of fear from overwhelming her. But in the middle of these small tasks, she stops abruptly. Her hands rest on the edge of the counter. Her breath halts. For a moment, the facade slips, and you see the turmoil inside her, the swirl of dread, longing, and helplessness colliding beneath the surface. Then, slowly, she gathers herself and returns to the table. Outside, footsteps approach the building, slow, measured, purposeful. The young woman freezes once more, her eyes fixed on the door. The older woman grips the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening. The steps climb the staircase. 1 floor, 2. Then they stop. A moment of silence. A soft knock. Not at their door, but close enough to steal the breath from the room. Voices murmur in the hallway. A woman cries out, a sharp, broken sound, followed by the low rumble of men offering condolences. The young woman closes her eyes briefly, her throat tightening. The older woman covers her mouth with her hand. They listen, their bodies rigid, as grief takes shape just beyond their door. When the footsteps move away again, descending slowly, the silence that follows is worse than the knock itself. A silence full of implication, full of possibility. The young woman does not speak. She does not cry. She simply places her hands in her lap and sits very still, as though any movement might invite fate to turn its gaze toward them next. As evening approaches, she insists on preparing supper, though neither of them has an appetite. She slices the bread with careful precision, her hands steady despite everything. She places a portion on the older woman's plate, then sits down with her own untouched piece. The older woman watches her, her eyes glistening. "You must eat," she whispers gently. The young woman shakes her head. She cannot swallow anything today. Hunger and dread occupy the same space in her body, and dread has won. When darkness comes and the blackout curtains are drawn, the room feels even smaller, even tighter. The young woman sits on the bed beside the older woman, her hand resting lightly on the older woman's arm, not to comfort, but to steady herself. They remain like this for a long time, listening to the sounds of the city settling into night. Then, almost imperceptibly, the young woman leans forward, her forehead resting against her folded hands. Her shoulders shake once, barely a tremor, before she regains control. It is the closest she has come to breaking. The older woman places a hand on her back, her voice soft with both love and fear. "We will face whatever comes," she murmurs. "Together." The young woman nods, lifting her head. Her expression is composed again, but her eyes carry a depth of sorrow that cannot be disguised. She extinguishes the lantern, lies beside the older woman, and waits for sleep that will not come. Tonight, the silence feels sharper than any siren, because tomorrow, news might finally arrive. And whether it brings relief or devastation, she cannot yet know. The day when news finally breaks through. Morning arrives with an uneasy stillness, not the calm of a city at rest, but the suspended quiet of people bracing themselves for whatever the day might bring. You see her rise earlier than usual, moving through the room with a muted urgency she tries to hide from the older woman. She checks the kettle, the window coverings, the emergency basket, not out of necessity, but to anchor herself in routine. Her hands move quickly, almost mechanically, as though speed might keep her thoughts from catching up. The older woman watches her with gentle concern. She knows today feels different. She can sense it in the young woman's silence, in the way she avoids looking toward the door, in the hesitant pauses between her movements. The fear that has lingered like a shadow now seems to press from every corner of the room. After breakfast, a quiet meal neither of them finishes, the young woman wraps a scarf around the older woman's shoulders and helps her into her coat. They step into the hallway together, the air cold and heavy, and walk toward the mail slots with the same mixture of hope and dread that has shaped so many mornings. But today, the atmosphere in the stairwell is different. A cluster of neighbors stands silently near the entrance, their expressions tight, their eyes fixed on a notice pinned to the wall. Paper flutters slightly under a draft, its edges worn from the hands that have already touched it. The young woman slows her steps, her breath tightening in her throat. When she reaches the notice, she reads the heading: "Notification of units affected. Postal disruption expected." Below it is a list. Names of divisions, battalions, companies, typed in a neat, impersonal format that strips them of all humanity. She scans the list quickly, then again more slowly, her eyes searching for the number she knows by heart. The older woman grips her arm. "Is it there?" she whispers. The young woman does not answer at first. Her gaze hovers over the line that matters, the line she had hoped not to see. When she finally speaks, her voice is steady, but her pulse reveals the truth. "Yes," she murmurs. "His unit is listed." The older woman closes her eyes, a quiet cry escaping her lips. The young woman's face remains composed, but the stillness is too controlled, too rigid, the only shield she has left. Neighbors step aside respectfully as they move back toward their apartment. Some offer sympathetic nods, some avert their eyes, unsure whether acknowledgement helps or harms. In wartime, even empathy becomes complicated. Inside, the young woman removes her coat with slow, deliberate movements. She sets it on the chair, smoothing the fabric with her palms even though it does not need smoothing. The older woman sits heavily, staring at the floor, her grief raw and uncontained. "Listen," the young woman says softly, kneeling in front of her. "This notice, it does not say what happened. It does not say who survived. It only says there has been disruption." She speaks calmly, choosing each word as if selecting stones to build a small bridge away from despair. "Until we know more, nothing is decided." The older woman nods through tears, but fear has already taken hold. "Disruption," she repeats, the word breaking unevenly from her lips. "That means, it could mean." The young woman gently takes her hands. "It could mean many things. We will not assume the worst. Not yet." Her voice does not tremble, but her hands do. Later, when the older woman lies down to rest, worn out by the weight of uncertainty, the young woman steps to the window. She lifts the blackout cloth slightly, enough to let in a narrow band of cold winter light. Her face is partially illuminated, pale, tired, but resolute. She rests her forehead briefly against the window frame. Just one breath. Just one moment where she allows herself to feel what she cannot show. Then she straightens. She puts water on the stove. She folds blankets. She sweeps the floor. Not because these tasks need doing, but because they are the only things within reach that she can control. The only way to hold herself steady until more news comes. And beneath every movement lies the same quiet prayer, unspoken but unmistakable. Let him be alive. Holding steady while the world tilts. The hours after reading the notice pass with a heaviness that settles into every movement she makes. Not panic, that would be simpler, but a deep, quiet disorientation, as though the world has tilted just a few degrees off its axis, and she must continually adjust her balance to keep from sliding into fear. You see it first in the way she moves between tasks. She prepares tea, but forgets to heat the water. She folds a blanket, then refolds it, unable to remember whether she finished the edges. She starts to mend a tear in the curtain, but sets the needle down halfway through a stitch, staring at it without seeing it. These small hesitations punctuate her day, revealing the frayed concentration beneath her outward calm. The older woman senses the shift. She sits near the stove, hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the young woman's face with a kind of heartbreaking tenderness. She wants to speak, to comfort, to reassure, but she knows any words might unravel the fragile composure the young woman is clinging to. Instead, she reaches out and lightly touches the young woman's arm as she passes. A small gesture, a warm anchor in a day filled with cold uncertainty. The young woman stops. She takes the older woman's hand, squeezing it just once, her expression softening for a moment before she resumes her tasks. It is a brief exchange, but it steadies them both. By midday, the neighborhood has become a chorus of speculation. Through the open window, you hear fragments of conversations drifting upward from the courtyard. Mail stopped for 3 whole battalions. Someone said the losses were severe. My cousin hasn't heard anything either. They're posting updates tomorrow. Maybe names. Each rumor sharpens the tension. Each version of events pulls at her composure like fraying thread. She closes the window, partly to keep out the cold, partly to quiet the noise. Inside, the silence grows. She returns to the shelf where the tin box is stored. This time, she does not open it. She rests her fingers on the lid, tracing its worn edges as if drawing strength from the memory of words inside. But she knows reading the letters now could either fortify her or break her, and she cannot risk either outcome, not when the older woman needs her steady. She places the box back on the shelf and smooths the fabric covering it. Then, with a breath that is barely audible, she resumes tending to the day. Later, when she steps into the courtyard to fetch water, neighbors approach her gently. One offers a sympathetic look. Another touches her arm in quiet solidarity. A third asks softly whether she plans to go to the district office in the morning. She nods once. "Yes," she says. Her voice is composed, but her eyes are tired. "I will go." As she walks back inside, she notices a piece of rubble near the steps, small fragments of brick loosened by the recent raid. Something about the way it crumbles under her thumb makes her pause. She holds it for a moment, then sets it carefully beside the wall. It is as if she cannot bring herself to discard anything today, not even debris. Inside, the older woman has prepared the table for supper, though neither has much appetite. The young woman sits down opposite her, breaking the bread into thin slices with unusual gentleness, as if the loaf might bruise under her touch. They eat in silence, forcing down small bites so the older woman will feel steadier, more grounded. The younger woman barely swallows hers. Afterward, she lights a small candle, only briefly, to warm the room before blackout preparations. The glow illuminates her face softly, revealing the exhaustion she has kept hidden beneath the surface all day. The older woman breaks the silence first. "We will learn the truth soon," she whispers. "And whatever it is, we will endure." The young woman nods, but her gaze drifts toward the window again, the direction from which news, good or terrible, always arrives. When she speaks, her voice is quiet, steady, and almost tender in its restraint. "I just need to know, one way or the other." The older woman nods, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. That night, after the blackout is secured, the young woman lies beside her, eyes open in the darkness. She listens to the distant hum of the city, footsteps, muffled voices, a cart rolling over uneven stones, every sound heightened by the pressure of what tomorrow might hold. She does not cry. She does not break. But she does something she rarely allows herself. She imagines his face, not in despair, not in longing, just to remember him fully, before any news tries to redefine what he means to her. Eventually, her breathing steadies, but she does not sleep. The night holds too much of tomorrow inside it. At the district office, facing what might be lost. She rises before dawn, long before the older woman wakes, long before the first footsteps echo through the courtyard. The air is cold enough to sting, but she moves quietly through the apartment, careful not to disturb the fragile calm of the early hour. She prepares the older woman's shawl, folds a small cloth with their papers inside, and gathers the items she knows they may need, though she cannot name exactly what purpose they serve on a day like this. When she kneels beside the older woman's bed, she wakes her gently, her voice soft but steady. "It is time." The older woman nods, her expression solemn. No one speaks of hope, or fear, or possibilities. All of it hangs between them, unspoken and heavy. Outside, the streets are still dim, lit only by the thin lavender glow of early morning. They walk slowly toward the district office, moving through a city that feels emptied out, not because no one is awake, but because those who are awake walk with the same purpose they do, their steps taut with dread. Women move in small groups, whispering, glancing at one another with a quiet solidarity reserved for those who share the same fear. When they reach the office, a line has already formed. Not a restless line, not a loud one, but a silent procession, as if the entire street understands the weight of gathering here. Some women clutch letters. Others hold photographs worn soft at the edges. A few carry nothing at all, their hands clasped tightly in front of them as though empty palms could somehow brace against the truth. She takes her place at the end of the line, helping the older woman settle on a low bench against the wall. The cold stone seeps through their coats, but neither comments. The young woman keeps her face composed, her posture straight, her breath measured. Yet you see the small signs of strain, the way her thumb presses into the palm of her hand, the way her gaze flickers briefly to the door each time it opens. Inside the building, you can hear voices, quiet, tired, strained. A clerk calling names, papers rustling, low sobs, the muffled collapse of someone whose world has just changed forever. These sounds seep through the walls like damp, settling into the bones of everyone waiting. The older woman takes the young woman's hand, gripping more tightly than her fragile fingers usually allow. The young woman squeezes back, but her eyes remain fixed ahead, refusing to let emotion surface until she knows which direction it must take. As the line moves, she steps forward with measured pace, offering her arm to the older woman, ensuring she does not stumble. Inside, the hall is cramped and dim, lit by a few lanterns hung unevenly along the wall. A long table stretches across one side, where officials sift through lists, typewritten sheets marked with numbers, units, statuses. The air smells faintly of ink, wet wool, and fear. When it is her turn, she steps forward. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, looks up at her. "Name of the soldier?" She says it clearly, without hesitation. The words feel heavier spoken aloud, as if naming him in this place risks pulling him closer to danger. "Unit." She gives the number. He nods, scanning the sheet in front of him. The pause that follows is unbearable, a pause shaped like a blade, a pause long enough for every terrible possibility to rush at her all at once. His eyes move across the page again, slower this time. He exhales quietly, as if bracing himself. The young woman's hands tighten around the strap of her bag. The older woman beside her murmurs a quiet prayer under her breath. Finally, the clerk looks up. His expression is not relief, not horror, something in between, something ambiguous and fragile. "We have no confirmation," he says gently. "No casualty notice. But no letters confirmed either. Mail from this division is severely delayed, possibly interrupted." The young woman's breath leaves her chest in a slow, controlled exhale. Her shoulders drop by the smallest fraction, not in relief, but in the release of a tension held too tightly for too long. The older woman grips her arm, tears forming. "He is not on the list," she whispers. The clerk continues, voice steady. "If there had been a loss confirmed, it would be here. But until communication is restored, I cannot give you certainty." Certainty. The one thing she cannot have. She nods, thanking him with quiet dignity. She does not ask for more. She knows he has given all he can, and that the absence of his pen on the casualty list is not hope, but something softer, thinner, more precarious. They step away from the table. A woman behind them collapses into sobs as her verdict is delivered. Another sinks onto a chair, her face drained of all color. Another lets out a gasping cry of relief. The young woman stands motionless for a moment, absorbing the weight of all these lives shifting around her. Then she turns to the older woman. "We keep waiting," she says softly. The older woman nods. But for the first time in days, the young woman's eyes flicker with something new, not hope, but the faintest spark of renewed endurance. Uncertainty remains the shape of her world, but today it has not shattered her. strength that does not announce itself. The walk home from the district office is quieter than the walk there. Not because the fear has lifted, it hasn't, but because uncertainty has taken on a new shape, one she can finally carry without feeling crushed beneath it. The older woman leans on her arm, exhausted yet visibly lighter than before. The young woman's steps are slow, steady, deliberate. She does not allow herself to rush or falter, or show how deeply the morning has unsettled her. But you see the truth in the small things. Her hands tremble slightly as she adjusts the older woman's shawl. Her eyes linger a fraction longer on the window where the postman usually appears. Her breath catches once, just once, when she passes a woman crying on a doorstep. These signs are quiet but unmistakable. The morning has cost her more than she will ever admit. Inside the apartment, she helps the older woman into her chair, kneeling for a moment to make sure her feet are warm enough. Only once the older woman is settled does she finally allow herself to exhale. The sound is soft, unsteady, almost defeated, but beneath it lies something stronger, something resilient. She sets water to boil, though she knows they have little tea left. She folds her coat over the back of a chair, smoothing the fabric twice, a grounding gesture. She wipes a patch of soot from the window frame, though she cleaned it only yesterday. These small actions are not distractions. They are stabilizers, things she can control in a day that offered her very little. When the tea is ready, she brings a cup to the older woman, holding it steady as she sips. The older woman watches her carefully, searching her face for signs of collapse. But the young woman meets her gaze with the same quiet steadiness she has always carried. "He is not lost," the older woman whispers, as though repeating it will keep the truth intact. The young woman nods. "No, not lost." But the words come out soft, thin around the edges. Later, she steps onto the small balcony to shake out a blanket. From here, the city feels too large, too damaged, too full of possibilities she cannot control. Smoke rises from a distant building where repairs are underway. A cart rattles by on the cobblestones below. A woman calls after her child, her voice sharp with worry. Ordinary sounds. But none of them feel ordinary anymore. She grips the blanket tightly, her knuckles whitening. For just a moment, she lets her shoulders fall forward, the weight of everything pressing against her spine. You can almost hear the thought forming inside her. If he is alive, he is somewhere out there in all of this. If he is alive, he is enduring things I cannot imagine. If he is alive, I must endure too. She straightens, folds the blanket, and re-enters the apartment. The rest of the day unfolds slowly. She checks their supplies, mends another seam, prepares a modest meal. But her movements have changed. They are gentler now, less sharp with fear. The knowledge that his name was not on any list is not relief, exactly. But it forms a ledge she can stand on, narrow, uncertain, but solid enough to pull breath into her lungs again. In the afternoon, a neighbor visits, offering a small loaf of bread in exchange for a bit of sewing work. The young woman accepts, grateful not just for the food, but for the simple act of human kindness. The older woman watches the exchange with soft eyes, understanding how these small gestures help keep despair at bay. Later, after supper, the young woman retrieves the tin box from the shelf. She does not open it. She simply holds it in her hands for a long moment, running her thumb along its edge. The older woman looks up from her chair. "You can read a letter," she says gently, but the young woman shakes her head. "Not tonight," she whispers. "If I read them now, I will start imagining what comes next. And I need to stay steady. For both of us." The older woman nods. She understands. Steadiness is the young woman's refuge, and her burden. When night falls and the blackout is secured, the young woman sits at the table, lantern dimmed to a soft glow. The flicker illuminates her face with a warmth that feels almost fragile. She closes her eyes, breathing slowly, gathering her strength for another day of waiting. She is not calm. She is not unafraid. But she is steady, and that steadiness is its own kind of courage. Tomorrow may bring news, or silence, or another list on another wall. But tonight, she allows herself one quiet truth. She has endured this much. She can endure a little more. Learning to live in the long uncertainty. Days pass, and the uncertainty does not resolve. Instead, it settles into the rhythm of her life, becoming something she must navigate rather than endure in single bursts. You see the gradual shift, not dramatic, not spoken aloud, but woven through the way she moves, plans, and thinks. She no longer listens for the postman with sharp, breathless attention. She listens with a quieter vigilance, the way one listens for rain that may or may not arrive. Hope and dread now share the same space inside her, neither strong enough to silence the other. Each morning begins the same way. She rises before the older woman, checks the mail slot even though she knows it is still too early, and returns to the kitchen to light a small flame under the kettle. Sometimes she stands at the stove longer than necessary, watching the flame flicker, letting its steadiness remind her of her own. She has not broken. She does not plan to. The older woman joins her slowly, leaning on the doorway for support. The young woman greets her with a soft smile, not bright, but warm enough to comfort. They share their modest breakfast in silence. It is not a heavy silence anymore, nor a relieved one. It is simply the space where they both exist now, waiting for a world they cannot predict. After breakfast, she resumes her routines, though they unfold at a gentler pace. She mends clothing with more focus. She sweeps with slower, measured strokes. She checks the cracks in the walls and marks them with chalk, maintaining quiet vigilance. These tasks give her shape, anchoring her day in something tangible. Yet beneath the surface, the uncertainty continues shaping her in ways even she does not notice. You see it in the way she pauses before stepping outside, a fraction of a second where she gathers herself. You see it in how she clasps her hands tighter when neighbors speak of the war's progress. You see it in how her posture straightens slightly when someone mentions casualty lists. Rumors have not stopped. If anything, they have multiplied. Women speak of entire battalions rerouted, of hospitals overflowing, of mail sacks destroyed in transit. But the young woman does not absorb these rumors the way she once did. She listens, nods, then quietly steps back out of the conversation, holding herself apart from the emotional currents of others. She cannot afford to drown in speculation, not when the older woman depends on her steadiness. In the courtyard, she finds small tasks to busy her hands. She helps a neighbor lift a heavy pail, adjusts a loose shutter, pulls aside a fallen branch blocking the walkway. She works not to distract herself, but because helping others gives her a sense of purpose stronger than fear. The older woman watches her with admiration and worry. "You are always moving," she says gently one afternoon. The young woman smiles faintly. It helps, and it does. Movement keeps her thoughts from spiraling. Action becomes reassurance. Each task completed is a small declaration that life continues, even under the long shadow of uncertainty. Inside the apartment, she checks the tin box again, not to open it, but to make sure it remains where she left it, unchanged, waiting. She touches the cloth wrapping with the same careful reverence as always, each gesture slow and protective. But today, instead of placing it back on the shelf immediately, she holds it in both hands for a moment. A silent dialogue passes between her and the memories folded inside. Not yet, she thinks. Not today. Reading would hurt more than it helps. She returns the box to its place and closes the cupboard gently. As the afternoon light dims, neighbors gather to discuss the next food delivery. She listens with calm attention, but her gaze often drifts toward the end of the street, the direction the postman would appear if the postal service resumes. She no longer flinches at every sound, but a quiet alertness remains, like a candle flame protected by cupped hands. Later, after supper, she sits by the window, watching the sky fade into charcoal gray. The older woman sits beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. Neither speaks. The silence feels shared now, no longer isolating. They are two lives bound not just by fear, but by companionship, by enduring together what neither could face alone. In the growing darkness, she finally speaks. "We will know something," she says softly. "Maybe not soon, but someday. We will know." The older woman nods, her eyes glistening. For the first time in many days, the young woman allows a slow breath to fill her lungs fully. She is not free from fear. She is not free from grief. But she is learning to live inside the uncertainty, to carry it without letting it swallow her. And as night settles around them, you sense a quiet truth emerging in her. She does not need certainty to keep going. She needs only the strength to meet each day as it arrives. Small steadies, quiet collapses. In the days that follow, life resumes its careful rhythm, but the uncertainty remains, woven into every task. It does not overwhelm her anymore, but it does alter her, leaving traces in her gestures, her expressions, the way she listens to the world. She moves with a calm exterior, yet you can see how her inner balance shifts from hour to hour. Some mornings, she rises with renewed steadiness. She tidies the room with brisk efficiency, braids her hair with quick, practiced motions, and straightens the older woman's shawl with a faint but genuine smile. On these days, she seems to stand a little taller, her breath deeper, her gaze clearer. And then there are other mornings. On those days, she stands too long at the window before opening the curtains, as if preparing herself for whatever she will see, or not see, outside. She hesitates before checking the mail slot, her hand hovering in midair for a beat too long. When nothing is there, she closes the compartment slowly, her fingers lingering on the metal as though absorbing its cold steadiness. But she never lets these small collapses show fully. She absorbs them, tucks them away, and continues. Inside the apartment, she maintains order not by force, but by quiet persistence. She boils water even when she knows they have only herbs, not tea. She sweeps the floor even when the dust returns each day from the damaged walls. She checks on the older woman frequently, offering small reassurances with touch rather than words. It is in the smallest details that the truth reveals itself. When she folds laundry, her hand sometimes pause mid-motion, resting on a garment that reminds her of him, a shirt he once wore, a scarf she knitted for him before he left. She does not cry, but the moment stretches, her breath caught between memory and longing. When she mends a tear in the older woman's apron, her stitches are steady, but her gaze drifts beyond the fabric, following thoughts she does not speak aloud. When she prepares a meal, she arranges the plates with care, as though creating order on the table might help stabilize the disorder inside her. The older woman sees all of this. She watches from her chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes full of a sorrow shaped not only by her own fears but by the young woman's quiet struggle. Sometimes she reaches out to touch the young woman's arm, offering wordless solidarity. And sometimes, when the young woman turns her face away too quickly, the older woman pretends not to notice the shimmer in her eyes. In the courtyard, neighbors continue to speak in hushed tones about the war's progress, about shifting front lines, missing men, disrupted mail routes. The young woman listens only long enough to stay informed, then steps away before the talk becomes too heavy. She has learned the boundaries of what her heart can carry, but she also finds steadiness outside. A neighbor gives her a few scraps of fabric for mending. Another brings word of a possible flower delivery. A child hands her a small wooden toy he found among the rubble. These small gestures soften the sharpness of her days. Evenings bring their own rituals. She dims the lantern early to conserve oil. She checks the blackout cloth with practiced hands. She places the tin box, the one holding his letters, on the table, but does not open it. She no longer reaches for it reflexively. Instead, she rests her fingertips on its lid, letting its familiar weight steady her. Sometimes she sits with the older woman and listens as she recounts stories from her youth, stories of hardships survived, losses endured, quiet triumphs earned over years of difficulty. The young woman listens attentively, absorbing the wisdom hidden in those memories. These stories do not erase her fear, but they wrap it in context, a reminder that human hearts have carried impossible loads before. On one particular night, you see a quiet shift. The young woman steps onto the balcony after blackout preparations are done. The city is dark, silent except for the distant thrum of repair work. She grips the railing, breathing in the cold air. For a long moment, she lets her shoulders drop, releasing the tension she has held so tightly. And then, unexpectedly, she closes her eyes and whispers something. Not a prayer, not a plea, but a simple acknowledgement. "I miss you." It is the first time she has allowed the words to form aloud. She opens her eyes, steadies herself again, and returns inside. The older woman looks at her closely. "Are you all right, child?" The young woman nods, and for once, the answer is neither forced nor false. "I will be," she says quietly. "Whatever comes, I will be." This is not certainty. This is resilience, the quiet kind that grows in the cracks of ordinary days, sustained by routine, responsibility, and the stubborn refusal to abandon hope entirely. Tonight, she does not feel strong. She feels steady. And sometimes, in a world built on uncertainty, steadiness is the truest strength a person can hold. A hint of spring, and the fragile return of light. Winter loosens its grip slowly, almost reluctantly. The air is still cold, but something has shifted. A softness at the edges of the wind, a faint brightness in the early morning light. You see her notice it first when she opens the window to air out the room. Instead of the usual sharp chill, a gentler current drifts in, carrying with it a smell she hasn't sensed in months. Damp earth. She pauses with her hand on the windowsill, her expression still careful, but touched by the smallest flicker of relief. Not joy, not yet, but a recognition that the season is changing, that the world outside their battered walls is trying, in its quiet way, to begin again. The older woman senses it too. She sits a little straighter, her eyes following the young woman's gaze toward the courtyard below, where patches of thawing ground break through the dirty snow. A few green shoots have dared to emerge beside the cracked fountain. Small, fragile things, but so unmistakably alive. When they step outside, the air feels different on their skin. No warmer, truly, but less hostile. The sky above the damaged rooftops is a pale blue, streaked with thin clouds that drift as though unburdened by the weight the city still carries. Some neighbors are already in the courtyard, sweeping away debris revealed by the melting snow. Their movements are slow, tired, but purposeful. Life has not become easier, but it has become slightly more possible. The young woman helps the older woman to her usual bench, placing a folded blanket beneath her to soften the cold stone. Then she begins her own work, clearing broken branches, shaking out winter-worn rugs, gathering a small pile of coal left from the delivery before the last raid. She works with the same quiet discipline as always, but there's something else now. A steadiness that no longer feels forced, a rhythm shaped not only by survival but by the promise of small renewal. It becomes visible in her posture, in the way she lifts her face toward the sun, in the way her breath releases, long and slow, as if her lungs finally remember what ease feels like. Neighbors greet her with warmer tones today. A woman offers her a sprig of dried herbs for cooking. Another shares news that the markets may open earlier next week, now that the worst of winter has passed. No one mentions letters or casualty lists, not out of avoidance, but because they sense she needs a brief reprieve from that weight. Still, as she sweeps the walkway, her eyes drift occasionally toward the end of the street where the postman used to appear. The hope remains there, quiet, cautious, but it no longer sharpens her expression into fear. It rests beside her other burdens, softened by the changing light. When they return to the apartment, she opens the windows fully for the first time in months. Fresh air flows through the room, carrying away stale smoke and the heavy scent of winter. Dust lifts into the sunlight, turning the air golden for a moment before settling again. The older woman watches with a soft smile, touched by the simple act of light entering the room. "It feels different today," she murmurs. The young woman nods. "Yes, it does." She begins to clean with renewed purpose, not the frantic cleaning of anxiety, but the hopeful kind. She scrubs the kitchen table until the wood shows through beneath the soot. She beats the blankets with more energy than usual, sending clouds of dust out into the open air. She even hums under her breath, a sound so quiet the older woman almost doesn't catch it. Later, she stands at the window, inspecting the small green shoots in the courtyard below. She doesn't smile outright, but her lips soften, the corners lifting just enough to reveal how deeply the sight moves her. It is not that her fears have disappeared. They haven't. The uncertainty remains, a constant companion. But today, for the first time in a long while, the uncertainty is not the only thing shaping her. There is another force now, slower, gentler, fragile as a new leaf pushing through thawing soil. The beginning of spring. The beginning of possibility. She touches the glass lightly, as if acknowledging the shift. For a moment, the war feels a little farther away. Not gone, but softened by the faint promise that life, even here, can still find a way to return. Moments of ordinary life returning. As the days grow incrementally longer, you begin to notice something subtle in her behavior, the gradual return of habits she had abandoned during the hardest months. They are small things, almost invisible unless you know her well, but each one signals a quiet reawakening, the way early spring flowers push through cold soil without announcing themselves. One morning, after sweeping the courtyard, she pauses beside the cracked fountain and brushes a strand of hair behind her ear, not out of weariness, but with a faint instinct for neatness she has not shown in a long time. The older woman watches from the bench, recognizing the gesture and smiling to herself. It is a glimpse of the young woman she once was, before fear narrowed her world. Inside the apartment, the shift becomes even clearer. She begins rearranging the shelves, moving items into more thoughtful order instead of the purely functional placements of winter. She goes through the mending basket with a different eye, setting aside a garment to repair not because it is necessary, but because she wants it to look nice. That small desire, for something to be not just useful, but lovely, signals the slow return of part of her spirit. She even adds a bit of dried herb to their midday broth, though she knows they must ration it carefully. When the older woman tastes it, her eyebrows lift in surprise, and the young woman laughs, softly, briefly, but with warmth. The sound fills the room in a way that feels unfamiliar and deeply welcome. In the courtyard, she notices other signs of life returning. Children play slightly louder, their voices no longer muffled by winter's severity. A neighbor pins laundry outside for the first time in months, letting it flutter in the timid sunlight. A man repairs a bicycle that has sat idle all season. These are not acts of denial, they are acts of resilience. She finds herself drawn into these small currents. When a neighbor asks for help lifting a basket, she responds with a steadier step. When an elderly man struggles with a window shutter, she joins him without hesitation. She does not overextend herself. She still carries the weight of waiting, but she allows herself to be part of the neighborhood again, instead of standing slightly apart as she did during the darkest weeks. Yet the uncertainty does not disappear. It lingers in quiet moments. When she hangs laundry on the line, her gaze still flicks toward the street where the postman may or may not appear. When she folds blankets, her hands occasionally pause, her fingers tightening on the fabric. When a distant explosion echoes from another district, a sharp reminder that the war continues, she stiffens for a moment, then forces her breath to steady. But the difference now is that fear is no longer the sole voice inside her. It shares space with other emotions: cautious optimism, gratitude for small comforts, the faint hum of the life she is rebuilding piece by fragile piece. One afternoon, she helps the older woman outside to feel the sunlight directly on her face. The older woman closes her eyes and smiles, lifting her chin toward the warmth. The young woman watches her, a soft expression settling over her features. She slips her hand into the older woman's, and for a brief moment they simply stand there, two figures shaped by hardship, holding onto a sliver of gentleness in a harsh world. Back inside, she opens the window again, letting the fresh air move through the room. The light lands on the table, illuminating the tin box where the letters are kept. She hesitates, then walks toward it. But this time, she does not pick it up. She simply smooths the fabric covering it and lets her hand rest there. It is not avoidance. It is acceptance. She will open it when she needs to, not to pull herself out of despair, but because she is strong enough again to read without unraveling. Later in the evening, she prepares supper with slower movements, not sluggish, but deliberate, as if she is allowing herself to savor the quiet moments rather than rush through them. She sets the table neatly, aligning the bowls and slices of bread with care. The older woman watches her from across the room, her eyes warm. "You are lighter today," she says gently. The young woman pauses, then nods. "Yes, just a little." She doesn't smile widely. That kind of joy would feel out of place in a city still bearing wounds. But she allows her lips to soften, the faintest curve forming at their edges. It is not happiness. Not yet. But it is the beginning of something that could become happiness someday, if the world allows it. A small ember, faint but real, glows inside her now. Spring has only just begun. So has she. The letter that changes the shape of waiting. The change arrives quietly, the way most life-altering moments do. Not with ceremony, not with warning. Just a sound in the stairwell that does not belong to routine. Footsteps. Measured. Unhurried. Familiar in their rhythm. You see her freeze at the table, one hand resting on the edge of a bowl she has just washed. The older woman looks up at the same instant. Neither speaks. They have learned not to speak when sound alone carries this much weight. The footsteps stop at the ground floor. A pause. Then the soft metallic scrape of the mail slots opening. Her breath stills. Not held deliberately, simply forgotten. She moves toward the door without thinking, her steps slow, controlled, as if moving too quickly might fracture whatever fragile balance holds the moment together. The older woman follows as best she can, gripping the back of a chair for support. The slot is no longer empty. An envelope rests inside, plain, slightly creased. dust smudged at the edges from a long journey. The handwriting is uneven, hurried, as though written under difficult conditions. But she recognizes it instantly, not by the name, not by the return address, but by the pressure of the pen against the paper. She has traced those letters before with her fingers, memorized their shape through repetition and longing. For a moment, she does not reach for it. This is the most dangerous second of all, the one where hope threatens to rise too fast. Then she lifts the envelope gently, as if it might dissolve in her hands. Alive does not enter her mind yet. Neither does loss. Only this. He wrote. The older woman leans closer, her voice barely audible. Is it? The young woman nods once. Yes. They return to the apartment together. She closes the door softly, deliberately, sealing the world outside away for just a moment. She sets the envelope on the table and sits down across from it, hands folded in her lap. She does not open it immediately. You see her steady herself first, a slow breath in, a slower breath out. She presses her thumb lightly against the edge of the paper, grounding herself in its physical reality. After so many weeks of imagining worst-case outcomes, she will not let relief overtake her before she understands what this letter contains. The older woman sits opposite her, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the envelope as if it might speak on its own. Finally, she breaks the seal. The paper inside is thin, creased, marked with dirt and rain stains. She unfolds it carefully, smoothing it flat on the table. Her eyes scan the first line, then stop. Her shoulders sag, not in collapse, in release. She does not cry. Tears would come later, if at all. What moves through her now is something quieter, deeper, the loosening of a knot pulled too tight for too long. He's alive, she says softly. The older woman exhales a sound that is half sob, half prayer. Her hand flies to her mouth. She bows her head, whispering thanks to no one and everyone at once. The young woman reads on. The words are spare, practical, written by someone conserving ink, paper, energy. He writes of delays, of dislocation, of confusion, of how mail has been impossible, of cold nights and long marches, of being safe, for now. For now. But that is enough. As she reads, you see her transform, not into joy, not into celebration, but into something steadier than both. Her spine straightens. Her breathing deepens. The tension that has lived behind her eyes for months finally releases its hold. When she reaches the end, she folds the letter slowly, carefully, aligning the creases as she always does. She does not rush to reread it. She does not clutch it to her chest. Instead, she rests her hand flat over it on the table. The older woman reaches across, placing her own hand over the young woman's. Their fingers overlap, trembling slightly. He will come home, the older woman whispers. The young woman does not answer right away. Then she nods. Yes, she says, not as a promise, not as certainty, but as something she finally allows herself to believe again. Outside, the city continues its battered routine. Carts rattle. Voices rise and fall. Somewhere, a siren sounds faintly and then fades. But inside the room, something fundamental has shifted. The waiting is no longer shapeless. It has a center again. After the letter, life breathes again. For a long moment after the letter is folded, neither of them speaks. The room feels altered, not brighter, not lighter in any dramatic way, but steadier, as if something invisible has settled back into place. You sense it in the way the young woman's shoulders remain relaxed instead of coiled, in the way her breath no longer catches between thoughts. She stands first, not abruptly, but with calm purpose. The movement itself feels significant. For weeks, every action has been weighed down by uncertainty. Now, motion comes more naturally. She pours fresh water into the kettle, this time without hesitation, and lights the stove. The flame catches quickly. She watches it for a moment, then turns away, trusting it to burn. The older woman wipes her eyes with the edge of her shawl, smiling through lingering tears. "I knew," she murmurs, not because she truly did, but because hope has a way of rewriting memory once it is rewarded. The young woman smiles faintly in response. Not the careful, restrained smiles of recent weeks, but something warmer, more genuine. Still measured, still cautious, but real. She reads the letter again once the kettle begins to steam. This time she moves more slowly, allowing herself to take in every word. She traces the uneven handwriting with her eyes, imagining the conditions under which it was written, the cold, the fatigue, the brief stolen moment to put pen to paper. The knowledge no longer wounds her. It connects her. When she finishes, she places the letter back on the table, not hidden away, not sealed back into the tin box yet. It stays where it is, a quiet presence rather than a fragile secret. The older woman reaches for it, touching the edge reverently. "May I?" she asks. The young woman nods. They read it together then, the older woman mouthing the words silently, nodding at familiar phrases, lingering on the simple declaration that matters most. "I am alive." Outside, the courtyard hums with its usual sounds. A broom scrapes stone. Someone laughs briefly, a sharp, surprised sound, quickly stifled. A door closes. Life goes on. But inside the apartment, time seems to slow, allowing the moment to settle fully into them. After tea, the young woman does something she has not done in months. She begins to plan. Not in grand gestures, not in declarations about the future, but in small, practical thoughts. She checks their supplies with a different eye now, not counting only what must last, but what might be needed if letters come more often. She considers setting aside paper, ink, a clean envelope. She thinks about what she will write back, and how she will keep her words steady so he will not worry. She opens the window wider, letting fresh air carry the faint scent of spring into the room. The light touches the table, illuminating the letter once more. She does not rush to hide it. She lets it exist in the open, like a promise that does not need guarding. The older woman watches her move through the room with renewed strength, her gaze filled with something close to peace. "You are different," she says softly. The young woman pauses, considering the words. Then she nods. "Yes," she replies. "I think I am." That night, when the blackout curtains are drawn and the lantern burns low, she finally places the letter back into the tin box. But she does so gently, almost ceremonially, laying it on top of the others instead of folding it away at the bottom. It belongs where it can be reached now. She sits beside the older woman on the bed, holding her hand as they listen to the city settle into darkness. For the first time in a long while, the night does not feel like a threat waiting to unfold. It feels like a pause, a necessary one, before another day. She lies down, closing her eyes without bracing herself. The war is not over. The danger has not passed. Nothing is resolved. But the waiting has changed. It is no longer empty. It is filled with a voice that crossed distance and chaos to reach her, proof that endurance can be answered, that patience can be met, that even in war, life can still send something back. And as sleep finally comes, it comes gently, not as escape, but as rest. Writing back across the distance. Morning arrives without urgency, not because the world has softened, it hasn't, but because something inside her no longer feels brittle. You see it in the way she wakes, in the unhurried stretch of her fingers, in the calm breath she takes before rising from the bed. The older woman is still asleep, her face eased by a rest that feels earned at last. The letter waits on the table. She approaches it quietly, as though approaching a living thing. For a moment, she only looks at it, the creased paper, the familiar handwriting now etched into memory with new meaning. Then she reaches for the small stack of paper she has kept untouched for weeks, saving it for a moment she did not know how to name. This is that moment. She sits, smooths the page, and lifts the pen. Her hand hesitates, not from fear, but from care. She understands now that what she writes will travel far, through hands and machines and uncertainty, and arrive carrying more than words. It must carry steadiness. It must carry reassurance. It must not burden him with the weight she has been holding. She begins simply. She tells him they are safe, that the older woman is well enough. That winter has loosened its grip. She does not describe the raids. She does not describe the hunger. She does not describe the weeks of silence that nearly hollowed her out. Instead, she writes about small truths, the green shoots in the courtyard, the return of light to the kitchen table, the way the city keeps moving even when it is wounded. She tells him she received his letter, and that it arrived like something precious rescued from a fire. Her pen moves steadily now, confidence building with each line. You sense how carefully she chooses her words, shaping them not as confession, but as shelter. She wants him to picture her standing, capable, enduring, because knowing that will help him stand too. At one point she pauses, staring at the page. There are words she wants to write, words that press hard against her chest, but she sets them aside. Love, fear, longing. These will wait. There will be time for them later. She signs her name slowly, deliberately. When she finishes, she folds the letter with practiced precision, aligning the edges as she always does. She slips it into an envelope and seals it, pressing the flap flat with her thumb. The act feels ceremonial, like closing a door gently rather than slamming it shut. The older woman wakes as she finishes. She watches silently from the bed, then speaks softly. "You wrote to him." The young woman nods. "Yes." The older woman smiles, not with relief, but with something deeper, recognition. This is what forward motion looks like in a war. Not triumph, not certainty, just connection restored, one letter at a time. They step outside together later that morning. The young woman carries the envelope carefully, protected inside her coat. The postman is not yet visible, but she walks to the mail slot anyway, as though rehearsing the act. When the time comes, she slips the letter into place without hesitation. It is done. As they walk back inside, you see how the act of writing has shifted her. The waiting still exists, it always will, but now it runs in both directions. A line has been cast outward again, carrying her voice into the vastness of the war. She has spoken back. And in doing so, she has reclaimed something essential, the knowledge that she is not only enduring history, she is participating in it, shaping it quietly with ink and resolve. Life resumes its careful forward motion. After the letter is sent, the day unfolds with a gentler rhythm. Not lighter, the war has not loosened its grip that easily, but steadier, as if the ground beneath her has firmed just enough to support another step forward. You notice the difference immediately in her movements. They are no longer driven solely by necessity, nor shadowed by the same tight vigilance. Purpose has returned to them, quiet, restrained, but unmistakable. She returns to the apartment and begins her routine anew, yet it feels subtly altered. When she sweeps the floor, she does not rush. When she prepares the midday meal, she allows the pot to warm a moment longer, letting the faint aroma linger in the room. These are not indulgences. They are acknowledgments that time exists again in small pockets, that not every action must be shaped by urgency alone. The older woman sits by the window, watching the courtyard with renewed interest. She comments on a neighbor hanging laundry, on the sound of children's voices drifting between buildings, on the faint warmth of the sun against the wall. The young woman listens, responding with brief smiles and nods, content to let these observations fill the space where fear once dominated. Later, she opens the cupboard and checks the tin box of letters. This time, she arranges them carefully, not as relics of absence, but as markers of continuity. His latest letter rests on top, no longer something fragile she must protect from herself, but something stable she can return to when she needs grounding. In the afternoon, she mends clothing near the window. The light is good, the air mild. Her stitches are even, confident. At one point, she hums again, not unconsciously, but with intention, a quiet tune remembered from before the war. The sound surprises even her, and she pauses, then continues, allowing it to exist without question. Neighbors pass by the open door, exchanging small courtesies. Someone asks if she might help with a repair later in the week. Another mentions that postal service seems to be improving, slowly, in fits and starts. She listens, absorbing the information without letting it pull her back into anxious anticipation. What will come will come. For now, she has done what she can. As evening approaches, she and the older woman share supper, modest, familiar, but eaten with a different presence. They talk a little more than usual. Nothing profound. Just observations, recollections, quiet plans for the next day. These exchanges feel precious precisely because they are ordinary. When darkness falls and the blackout is secured, she sits by the lantern and opens the tin box once more. This time, she rereads one of the older letters, not the most recent one, but an earlier one, written before everything became so uncertain. She reads it calmly, without bracing herself, allowing the memory it carries to exist without pain. She folds it carefully and returns it to its place. Then she extinguishes the lantern and lies down beside the older woman. Her thoughts do not spiral. They drift, touching briefly on the letter she sent, the one that will now travel outward into the war, carrying her steadiness with it. She knows waiting has not ended. She knows fear may return. She knows the war will continue to demand things of her. But she also knows this. She has learned how to endure without disappearing, how to hope without unraveling, how to move forward without certainty. And tonight, that is enough. The city breathes around them, wounded, restless, enduring. Inside the darkened room, she breathes with it, no longer bracing against every sound. Life, in its careful way, has resumed its forward motion. When waiting becomes a way of living. Waiting does not leave her life after the letter is sent. It changes its posture. It no longer stands directly in front of her, blocking the path forward. Instead, it walks beside her, present, quiet, manageable. You see this in the way she structures her days now, no longer arranging everything around absence, but around continuity. Each morning still begins early. She rises before the older woman, checks the window coverings, lights the kettle, and listens to the city awaken. But the tension that once lived in these moments has softened. She no longer scans the street with sharp urgency. She glances, registers, then turns back to the work of the day. The older woman joins her at the table, moving more easily now that winter has loosened its grip. They share breakfast in calm silence, broken occasionally by small observations. The weather, a neighbor's repairs, the sound of carts on the street. These conversations do not fill space. They confirm it. They are proof that life has widened again, even if only slightly. The routines remain disciplined. Rations are measured carefully. Coal is conserved. Blackout habits stay in place. But the meaning behind them has shifted. These are no longer acts performed under constant fear of collapse. They are practices, learned, internalized, and sustained with quiet competence. You notice how she handles interruptions now. When rumors surface in the courtyard, she listens without absorbing them. When sirens sound in the distance, she responds with readiness rather than panic. When days pass without new letters, she acknowledges the absence without letting it hollow her out. Waiting has become something she carries, not something that consumes her. In the afternoons, she gives herself small windows of rest. Not idleness, rest with intention. She sits near the window and sews. She steps into the courtyard to help a neighbor. She allows sunlight to touch her face without immediately retreating into vigilance. These moments are brief, but they matter. They signal trust, not in the world, but in her own capacity to adapt. The older woman notices the change and names it one evening as they prepare for nightfall. "You are no longer counting the hours," she says softly. The young woman considers this, then nods. "Yes," she replies, "I am counting the days." There is no drama in the statement, just recognition. Days are survivable units. They can be shaped, filled, endured. Hours were too sharp, too immediate. Days allow breathing room. That night, as she secures the blackout curtains and dims the lantern, she feels no rush to lie down immediately. She sits at the table for a moment, hands folded, listening to the sounds of the building settling around her. A child laughs somewhere below. Someone coughs in the stairwell. A door closes gently. Life, imperfect and strained, continues. Waiting has not ended, but it has been integrated. It is no longer the center of her existence. It is simply part of how she lives now. The shape of strength that remains. Over time, the waiting reshapes her, not into someone hardened or numb, but into someone precise about where she places her energy. You see it in the way she chooses what to carry and what to leave behind. She no longer reacts to everything. She responds only to what requires her. In the courtyard, when conversations drift toward fear or speculation, she listens politely, then steps away. She does not cut herself off from others, but she does not allow their anxieties to become her own. This is not detachment. It is discernment, a skill learned through long exposure to uncertainty. Her strength now shows itself in quiet decisions. She agrees to help a neighbor repair a damaged window, knowing it will take time and effort, because it contributes to a shared stability. She declines another request that would overextend her, offering a gentle explanation without apology. She has learned that endurance depends not on doing everything, but on doing enough. Inside the apartment, she keeps things orderly but not rigid. Objects return to their places, but she no longer straightens them compulsively. The tin box of letters remains accessible, not hidden away, not handled obsessively. Some days she opens it. Some days she doesn't. Either choice feels acceptable now. When she reads his letters, she does so with a steadier heart. She notices details she once rushed past. Small observations, dry humor, brief mentions of other men, of places passed through quickly. These details ground her. They make him real again, not just a figure shaped by fear or hope. The older woman watches her with something like pride. "You have learned how to live inside this," she says one evening, not as praise, but as recognition. The young woman nods. "Yes," she answers. "I had to." As the weeks pass, the city remains wounded, but functional. Repairs continue. Markets reopen sporadically. Postal routes stabilize, then falter again, then stabilize once more. Letters arrive irregularly, but they arrive. Each one reinforces the rhythm she has built. Receive, read, respond, return to life. And yet, she does not let the letters become the axis of her days. They are part of the fabric now, not the loom itself. On a quiet afternoon, she sits by the window and realizes something with mild surprise. She is thinking about the future without immediately stopping herself. Not in grand terms, not in promises, just in possibilities. Where they might live. What work might look like after the war. How the older woman will manage when the world changes again. These thoughts no longer feel dangerous. They feel earned. At night, when the city darkens and the blackout settles in, she still prepares carefully. Habit does not vanish simply because fear recedes. But she no longer lies awake counting distant sounds. Sleep comes more easily now. Not always, but often enough. Her strength has taken a new shape. It is not vigilance alone. It is balance. It is knowing when to brace and when to rest. Waiting remains part of her life. It always will. But it no longer defines her. She has built something durable inside herself. A quiet, resilient center that does not collapse when the world shifts. And from that center she continues, one day at a time, not as someone merely surviving the war, but as someone who has learned how to live within it. News that does not hurry. The next letter does not arrive quickly. It comes after days that blend together, days shaped by routine, by patience, by the practiced art of not leaning too hard toward expectation. You see how she manages this now. She no longer positions herself near the door at certain hours. She no longer listens for footsteps with the same intensity. She lets the day move first. When the letter does arrive, it does so quietly, almost anonymously, slipped into the mail slot without ceremony. There is no knock, no warning, just paper where there had been nothing. She notices it not immediately, but when she goes to check the kettle and passes the door, her gaze flicks downward, registers the envelope, then stills. For a moment, she does nothing, not because she is afraid, but because she understands the importance of pace. She picks it up gently, weighing it in her hand. The handwriting is familiar again. Steady, controlled, a little firmer than before. Alive is no longer a question that strikes her like lightning. It is an assumption she holds carefully. She brings the letter to the table and sits. The older woman senses the shift in the room and joins her without asking. They sit together, facing the envelope as they have learned to do, not as supplicants, but as witnesses. She opens it. The words are calmer this time, less urgent. He writes of movement, of waiting between orders, of boredom that presses harder than fear. He mentions letters received, hers among them, and thanks her for the steadiness of her words. He tells her they helped him sleep. He tells her they reminded him that life exists beyond mud and marching. She pauses there, her fingers tightening slightly on the page. This is new. Not survival. Not reassurance. Connection moving in both directions again. He does not promise anything. He does not speculate about timelines or outcomes. He writes as someone who understands the fragility of such things. But beneath the restraint, something steadier has formed, a rhythm of correspondence that no longer feels like rescue, but like continuity. When she finishes reading, she folds the letter slowly and places it atop the others. The motion is unhurried, confident. The older woman exhales softly, not in relief, but in recognition. "He sounds stronger," she says. "Yes," the young woman replies. "So do we." The rest of the day continues unchanged. She prepares food. She helps a neighbor mend a shutter. She listens to the city breathe through broken walls and temporary repairs. But something subtle has shifted again, not dramatically, not outwardly, but inward. Waiting is no longer the dominant posture. Living is. She no longer measures time by letters alone. She measures it by completed days, by shared meals, by evenings that end in rest instead of tension. The war continues. The uncertainty remains. But she has learned something essential. News does not always arrive to change everything at once. Sometimes it arrives to confirm that what you have built inside yourself is strong enough to hold. What endures when nothing is certain? After the letter is folded away, the day settles into its familiar shape, and this time that familiarity brings comfort rather than strain. You notice how naturally she returns to her tasks, how little effort it takes now to move from one moment to the next. The letter has not lifted the war from her shoulders, but it has confirmed something vital. The life she has built here, under pressure and uncertainty, is holding. In the afternoon, she sits by the window mending a tear in a coat. The light is steady, pale but sufficient. Her stitches are precise, unhurried. She no longer works as if racing against loss. She works as if investing in continuation. Each repair is an act of belief, not in a promised future, but in the value of the present being cared for. The older woman dozes nearby, her breathing even. From time to time, she stirs and offers a comment about the street below. A delivery cart passing, a neighbor pausing to speak with someone, the sound of distant construction. These observations no longer carry urgency. They are simply markers of a world that persists. When the young woman finishes her mending, she folds the coat carefully and sets it aside. She opens the cupboard and looks briefly at the tin box of letters. She does not open it this time. She knows what is inside. She knows what it gives her. There is no need to reach for it every day anymore. Later, she steps into the courtyard to help draw water. The air is cool, touched with the promise of another mild evening. She exchanges a few words with a neighbor, listens to a small complaint, offers practical help. Her presence is calm, grounded. Others sense it. People gravitate towards steadiness in uncertain places. As dusk approaches, she prepares the evening meal with practiced ease. The portions are still modest. Scarcity has not vanished. But the act of cooking feels less like calculation and more like care. She tastes the broth, adjusts it slightly, then serves it without apology. They eat together in quiet companionship. The older woman smiles more easily now. She speaks of things she would not have mentioned weeks ago, a childhood memory, a recipe she once knew by heart, a hope for seeing the countryside again someday. The young woman listens, absorbing these fragments of a life that extends beyond survival. When night comes, blackout routines are followed as always. Habit remains. Discipline remains. But fear no longer drives either. The room settles into darkness without tension. Before lying down, the young woman stands at the window one last time, looking out over the city. The lights are hidden. The streets are subdued. But beneath it all, life continues, imperfect, wounded, persistent. She thinks briefly of him, not as someone lost or endangered, but as someone moving through his own version of endurance, sustained now by words she sent and words she received. The connection does not eliminate distance. It makes the distance survivable. She lies down beside the older woman and closes her eyes. What endures is not certainty, not safety, not even hope, as people like to imagine it. What endures is rhythm, care, the ability to keep living well enough, even when answers remain incomplete. And in that endurance, quiet, uncelebrated, deeply human, she has found something that cannot be taken from her. The city learns to breathe between sirens. By late in the war, the city does not feel safer, exactly. It feels practiced. The buildings are more damaged, the streets more worn, the faces more lined. But beneath the fractures, a kind of hard-won rhythm has taken root. People know how to move through danger now. They know how to resume life in the spaces between alarms. You see it most clearly in her, and in the way the world around her has begun to mirror the quiet steadiness she carries. You follow her down the familiar stairwell as she descends with the older woman on her arm. The walls bear new cracks, old chalk marks, and faint fingerprints from 100 hands that have steadied themselves here. The older woman moves slowly, but more surely than in the deep winter months. Her steps are small, but her grip is not as desperate. She has learned, like everyone else, how to live inside this strange normal. Outside, the courtyard looks changed and unchanged all at once. New rubble has appeared. Old rubble has been cleared away. Windows once shattered are now patched with mismatched glass or layered cloth. A makeshift garden, only a few rows of stubborn plants, clings to the edge of a wall that leans but still holds. Children play around it, careful not to trample the fragile shoots. Their laughter, though quieter than before the war, is no longer entirely cautious. She helps the older woman settle onto the familiar bench and adjusts the blanket beneath her. The older woman lifts her face to the pale light, closing her eyes for a moment in something close to contentment. The young woman stays standing, scanning the courtyard as she always does, not anxiously, not obsessively, but with the practiced alertness of someone who has accepted that calm and danger will always exist side by side. You remember the first nights in the bunker, the raw fear, the unsteady rituals, the way every sound felt like a threat. Those nights still come, sometimes, but they no longer erase the days. The days now have weight of their own. The postman passes at the far end of the street. He nods toward her. There is no envelope today, but his presence alone feels like confirmation that the line between here and there remains intact. Letters arrive irregularly now, but they arrive often enough that silence no longer feels like a verdict. It feels like part of the landscape. She turns back to the courtyard. A neighbor waves her over to help move a broken door frame. Another asks if she has any spare thread. Someone calls out a brief update about food deliveries, about changes in ration schedules, about rumors of the front shifting further away. She listens, nods, responds when needed. She does not rush. She does not withdraw. She simply occupies her place in this shared, damaged, enduring world. You follow her as she returns upstairs with a bucket of water, her steps even, her breathing steady. Inside the apartment, the room feels less like a shelter pressed tightly against the war, and more like a home adapted to it. The table is worn but clean. The cupboard is organized with quiet care. The tin box of letters sits on the shelf, not hidden, not displayed, just present. She sets the bucket down, wipes her hands on her apron, and pauses by the window. The courtyard below is framed by cracked plaster and patched glass, but the view holds. A woman hangs laundry. A boy bounces a ball, its dull thud echoing off the walls. A warden walks past, his pace no longer frantic, just steady. You feel the shift in her as she watches. Once, every sight out that window was filtered through a single question. Will we survive this? Now, another question stands beside it. What kind of life can we hold while we do? She turns away, checks on the older woman, then moves through the room with the ease of someone no longer testing the floor beneath her feet. She knows where everything is. She knows what each object can withstand. She knows that if the siren sounds, she will be ready. She also knows that until it does, the day is hers to inhabit, not merely to outlast. Later, as she prepares the midday meal, you notice small signs of this new balance. She measures the rations with the same care as always, but her movements are less tight. She sets an extra bit of potato aside, not because she must, but because she chooses to save for tomorrow, to share with a neighbor, to hold as a small act of control that is no longer born only of fear. The older woman watches her, eyes soft with something more than gratitude. "You have become very strong," she says quietly. The young woman smiles, a real, unguarded smile that reaches her eyes. "I have had to," she answers. "We all have." You recognize the truth in that. Strength here is not a sudden transformation, not a heroic gesture. It is cumulative, built from every night in the bunker, every morning of repair, every ration line, every unanswered day at the mail slot. It is the strength of someone who has learned to stand in a world that does not promise her anything, yet still finds ways to give, to mend, to care. When afternoon light slants across the room, she sits briefly at the table, resting her hands on its worn surface. The war has not ended. No one knows exactly when it will. Peace is not a date circled on a calendar. It is a distant possibility, somewhere beyond the horizon of the next siren. But for the first time, she does not live pressed against that horizon. She lives here, in this room, in this courtyard, in this city that has learned to breathe between sirens. You remain beside her as she listens to the faint sounds outside, a cart, a voice, a door. Each noise blends into a quiet, imperfect ordinary. She closes her eyes just for a moment, not to escape, but to rest inside that ordinary, the one she has helped to preserve piece by piece. She knows danger may still come. She knows loss may yet arrive. But she also knows something she did not know at the beginning, that even under falling bombs, even underground, even in the longest stretches of not knowing, there is room for lives that are more than fear. The war is still shaping her days. But it no longer defines her entirely. She has built something that endures alongside it, a life that, in its careful, unremarkable way, continues. A life that no longer waits to begin. As evening settles, you notice how little ceremony now surrounds the end of the day. Once, nightfall meant bracing, counting supplies, rehearsing escape, tightening fear into something manageable. Now it means continuity. She closes the windows, adjusts the blackout cloth, and lights the lantern to its lowest flame. The motions are practiced, calm, unremarkable. That is the point. The older woman sits nearby, knitting slowly with salvaged yarn. Her hands are steadier than they were months ago. Not strong, but capable. The young woman moves through the room, placing things where they belong, not because order must be imposed, but because it already exists. The apartment carries the marks of war, but it also carries a lived-in confidence. This space has held and will hold again. You see how the city has taught her restraint. She no longer looks toward the street with expectation each time a sound rises. She no longer measures her hours against what might arrive. Letters come when they come. Sirens sound when they sound. Between those moments, life proceeds, quietly, deliberately, without apology. She sits at the table for a moment, hands folded, listening. Somewhere below, a radio plays softly before being turned down. Footsteps pass in the stairwell. A neighbor laughs, briefly, surprised by the sound of her own voice. These details no longer feel fragile. They feel earned. The older woman breaks the quiet. "Do you remember," she says, "how the nights used to feel?" The young woman nods. She does not answer immediately. When she does, her voice is level. "Yes. But I don't live there anymore." You understand what she means. The past still exists, the fear, the bunker, the long silence, but it no longer claims her attention by default. Memory has found its proper scale. It informs her without ruling her. She rises, checks the emergency basket by the door out of habit, then leaves it untouched. Everything is in place. If the siren comes, she will move. If it doesn't, she will rest. Either way, the choice no longer costs her. Before sleep, she opens the cupboard and glances at the tin box of letters. She does not open it. She does not need to. The connection it represents is stable now, present without constant confirmation. She closes the cupboard and turns off the lantern. In the darkness, the room does not tighten around her. It settles. She lies down beside the older woman, listening to the steady rhythm of breathing, her own and another's, aligned without effort. You remain with her in that quiet, sensing the final shift that has taken so long to complete. This is not relief, not victory, not even hope, as it is usually told. It is something more durable, the ability to inhabit a life fully, even when the future refuses to clarify itself. Waiting once dominated her days. Now it has a place, not a throne. The war continues beyond the walls. The city remains damaged, alert, unfinished. But inside this room, and inside her, a life has taken root that no longer asks permission to exist. It moves forward without announcement, sustained by habit, care, and the knowledge that endurance, when practiced long enough, becomes a way of living. She does not know how the war will end. She does not need to. Tonight she sleeps, not as someone suspended in fear, but as someone present in her own life, ready to meet whatever comes next without surrendering what she has learned to hold. What remains when the sirens fade? Afterward does not arrive as a single moment. There is no clear dividing line where war ends and peace begins. Instead, the noise recedes unevenly, like water draining from broken streets. Some days are quiet, others still tremble, and through it all, life continues in a way that feels unfamiliar, cautious, and strangely exposed. You see her in this afterward not as someone transformed, but as someone revealed. The routines remain. She still wakes early, still checks the windows, still measures food and light with care. Habit does not disappear just because danger lessens, but the reason behind the habit has changed. It is no longer driven by fear alone. It is driven by memory, by the knowledge of what happens when attention lapses, and by respect for the life that survived because it did not. The city wears its scars openly now. Buildings stand half-repaired. Streets are uneven. Gaps remain where houses once held families, conversations, ordinary mornings. People move differently through these spaces. Slower, more deliberate, as if aware that the ground itself remembers what it carried. You walk with her through these streets and notice how she navigates them. She does not avoid the damaged places, nor does she linger in them. She passes through with quiet acknowledgement. This happened. We lived. We continue. The older woman walks beside her, still leaning, still careful, but present. Their bond has shifted too. Once it was built on protection and necessity. Now it rests on something steadier, shared endurance. They have seen each other at the edge of exhaustion, at the edge of fear, and have learned what survives there. When they sit together, they speak more freely. Not about heroism, not about meaning, but about ordinary things. How the bread tastes now, how the light falls differently in the afternoon, how sleep feels deeper than it once did. These observations matter. They are proof that attention has returned to life itself, not just to its defense. You notice how she listens now. Not for sirens, not for footsteps that might carry news, but for tone, for intention, for what is said and what is no longer avoided. Silence no longer feels like a threat. It feels like space, something that can be inhabited rather than endured. She still thinks of him, often, but the thought no longer collapses her inward. It has weight without sharpness. He exists somewhere beyond her immediate reach, shaped by his own version of endurance. They are no longer frozen in the same moment of fear. They are moving forward on parallel paths, connected not by desperation, but by continuity. This is what aftermath looks like from the inside. Not relief, not triumph, but a careful reckoning with what has been carried. You see it in how she handles objects now. The tin box of letters is still there, but it no longer feels like an anchor holding her in place. It is part of a larger landscape of memory, something she can open, close, revisit, or leave untouched without losing balance. Memory has found proportion. The nights are quieter, but not empty. She still wakes sometimes, not from fear, but from habit. When she does, she listens, not for danger, but for confirmation that the world is still there. The building settles. Someone turns in their sleep. A distant train passes. These sounds no longer trigger movement. They confirm presence. You understand, watching her, that survival has taught her something permanent. Not resilience as a slogan, but discernment. She knows now what deserves her energy and what does not. She knows when to act, when to wait, and when to simply be. The war took many things: time, certainty, illusion. But it did not take this: the ability to live attentively, to care without being consumed, to stand inside uncertainty without shrinking. As the days move forward, not marked by dates or declarations, she becomes part of the city's slow reassembly. Not as a symbol, not as a survivor to be admired, but as a person who knows how to live when guarantees are gone. This is the true aftermath. Not the absence of war, but the presence of people who have learned how to carry life through it, and who refuse to surrender that knowledge when the noise finally begins to fade. What you carry forward. When the war finally loosens its hold, not ending cleanly, not announcing itself, what remains is not silence, but adjustment. You notice it in her first, in the way she no longer flinches at every distant sound, yet never fully forgets how quickly sound once meant danger, in the way her body still remembers how to move when alarms rise, even as her mind begins to accept mornings that arrive without them. You walk with her through this afterward, and you understand that survival does not conclude when fighting slows. It continues in quieter forms, in learning which habits to keep and which to loosen, in deciding how much vigilance is protection and how much becomes a cage. She keeps some routines. Others fall away naturally. She still measures light carefully at night, but no longer counts minutes in the dark. She still stores food thoughtfully, but no longer eats as if tomorrow is always in question. The difference is subtle, but profound. Fear once dictated every decision. Now memory advises them. The city around her is learning the same lesson. Rubble is cleared not all at once, but steadily. Scars remain visible. Some will always remain, yet life moves among them without apology. Children adapt fastest. Adults follow more slowly. Everyone carries something invisible that does not announce itself, but shapes the way they stand, listen, speak. You see how she has changed in conversation. She no longer explains herself when she pauses, no longer apologizes for silence. She understands now that silence can be a form of listening, and listening a form of respect, for herself, for others, for what was endured. Sometimes she thinks back to the bunker, to the weight of bodies pressed together, to the sound of earth trembling overhead. Those memories do not arrive as wounds anymore. They arrive as reference points. This is how far I can bend. This is what I can survive. This is what must never be taken lightly again. The older woman remains beside her, slower now, but steady. Their relationship has settled into something unspoken and strong. Not gratitude, not dependence. Partnership. They share space without filling it. They understand each other's silences. They know which memories need words, and which ones need only presence. And sometimes, quietly, without ceremony, she allows herself to imagine beyond endurance. Not fantasy, not promises, just continuation. A room repaired fully, one day. A table without ration marks carved into it. A window opened without calculation. She does not rush these thoughts. She has learned what happens when hope outruns reality. But she no longer forbids them either. They belong now, alongside caution and care. You understand, standing here with her, that what she carries forward is not trauma alone. It is knowledge. She knows how communities hold when structures fail. She knows how people become lifelines without ever naming themselves as such. She knows that strength does not roar. It organizes, adapts, repeats. These are not lessons she wanted, but they are lessons she will not lose. When letters arrive now, they are read with steadiness. When they do not, the absence no longer defines the day. She has learned how to live between confirmations, how to let uncertainty exist without letting it rule. At night, she sleeps more deeply. Not every night, but often enough to trust rest again. Dreams come and go. Some are heavy. Some are ordinary. The ordinary ones surprise her most. You feel the story settling, not into an ending, but into a landing. This is where the war leaves her. Not whole, not broken, but shaped. A person who understands limits, and therefore understands value. A person who knows what quiet costs, and what it offers in return. And as you step back from her life, from this city, from these years of strain and adaptation, you recognize the truth that remains when history grows quiet. What matters is not how loudly suffering announces itself, but how gently people learn to live again afterward. What endures is not the violence, but the ways people carried one another through it. What stays is not fear, but the discipline of care learned in its shadow. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.